on those who hold the largest burden of responsibility. To be rigorous in people decisions means first becoming rigorous about top management people decisions. Indeed, I fear that people might use first who rigor as an excuse for mindlessly chopping out people to improve performance. It's hard to do, but we've got to be rigorous, I can hear them say. And I cringe. For not only will a lot of hardworking, good people get hurt in the process, but the evidence suggests that such tactics are contrary to producing sustained great results. The good to great companies rarely used headcount lopping as a tactic, and almost never used it as a primary strategy. Even in the Wells Fargo case, the company used layoffs half as much as Bank of America during the transition era. 6 of the 11 good to great companies recorded 0 layoffs from 10 years before the breakthrough date all the way through 1998, and 4 others reported only 1 or 2 layoffs. In contrast, we found layoffs used 5 times more frequently in the comparison companies than in the good to great companies. Some of the comparison companies had an almost chronic addiction to layoffs and restructurings. 42. It would be a mistake, a tragic mistake, indeed, to think that the way you ignite a transition from good to great is by wantonly swinging the axe on vast numbers of hardworking people. Endless restructuring and mindless hacking were never part of the good to great model. How to be rigorous. We've extracted 3 practical disciplines from the research for being rigorous rather than ruthless. Practical discipline number 1, when in doubt, don't hire, keep looking. One of the immutable laws of management physics is Packard's law. So called because we first learned it in a previous research project from David Packard, co-founder of the Hewlett-Packard Company. It goes like this: no company can grow revenues consistently faster than its ability to get enough of the right people to implement that growth and still become a great company. If your growth rate in revenues consistently outpaces your growth rate in people, you simply will not, indeed cannot, build a great company. Those who build great companies understand that the ultimate throttle on growth for any great company is not markets, or technology, or competition, or products. It is one thing above all others, the ability to get and keep enough of the right people. The management team at Circuit City instinctively understood Packard's law. Driving around Santa Barbara the day after Christmas a few years ago, I noticed something different about the Circuit City store. Other stores had signs and banners reaching out to customers, always the best prices, or great after holiday deals, or best after Christmas selection, and so forth. But not Circuit City. It had a banner that read, always looking for great people. The sign reminded me of our interview with Walter Bruckart, vice president during the Good to Great years. When asked to name the top 5 factors that led to the transition from mediocrity to excellence, Bruckart said, 1 would be people. 2 would be people. 3 would be people. 4 would be people. And 5 would be people. A huge part of our transition can be attributed to our discipline in picking the right people. Bruckart then recalled a conversation with CEO Alan Wurtzel during a growth spurt at Circuit City. Alan, I'm really wearing down trying to find the exact right person to fill this position, or that position. At what point do I compromise? Without hesitation, Alan said, you don't compromise. We find another way to get through until we find the right people. 43. One of the key contrasts between Alan Wurtzel at Circuit City and Sidney Cooper at Silo is that Wurtzel spent the bulk of his time in the early years focused on getting the right people on the bus, whereas Cooper spent 80% of his time focusing on the right stores to buy. 44. Wurtzel's first goal was to build the best, most professional management team in the industry. Cooper's first goal was simply to grow as fast as possible. Circuit City put tremendous emphasis on getting the right people all up and down the line, from delivery drivers to vice presidents. Silo developed a reputation for not being able to do the basics, like making home deliveries without damaging the products. 45. According to Circuit City's Dan Rexinger, we made the best home delivery drivers in the industry. We told them, you are the last contact the customer has with Circuit City. We are going to supply you with uniforms. We will require that you shave, that you don't have BO. You're going to be professional people. The change in the way we handled customers when making a delivery was absolutely incredible. We would get thank you notes back on how courteous the drivers were. 46.5. Years into Wurtzel's tenure, Circuit City and Silo had essentially the same business strategy, the same answers to the what questions, yet Circuit City took off like a rocket, beating the general stock market 18.5 to 1 in the 15 years after its transition, while Silo bumped along until it was finally acquired by a foreign company. 47. Same strategy, different people, different results. Practical discipline number 2, when you know you need to make a people change, act. The moment you feel the need to tightly manage someone, you've made a hiring mistake. The best people don't need to be managed. Guided, taught, led, yes. But not tightly managed. We've all experienced or observed the following scenario. We have a wrong person on the bus and we know it. Yet we wait, we delay, we try alternatives, we give a 3rd and 4th chance, we hope that the situation will improve, we invest time in trying to properly manage the person, we build little systems to compensate for his shortcomings, and so forth. But the situation doesn't improve. When we go home, we find our energy diverted by thinking, or talking to our spouses, about that person. Worse, all the time and energy we spend on that one person siphons energy away from developing and working with all the right people. We continue to stumble along until the person leaves on his own, to our great sense of relief, or we finally act, also to our great sense of relief. Meanwhile, our best people wonder, what took you so long? Letting the wrong people hang around is unfair to all the right people, as they inevitably find themselves compensating for the inadequacies of the wrong people. Worse, it can drive away the best people. Strong performers are intrinsically motivated by performance, and when they see their efforts impeded by carrying extra weight, they eventually become frustrated. Waiting too long before acting is equally unfair to the people who need to get off the bus. For every minute you allow a person to continue holding a seat, when you know that person will not make it in the end, you're stealing a portion of his life, time that he could spend finding a better place where he could flourish. Indeed, if we're honest with ourselves, the reason we wait too long often has less to do with concern for that person and more to do with our own convenience. He's doing an okay job, and it would be a huge hassle to replace him, so we avoid the issue. Or we find the whole process of dealing with the issue to be stressful and distasteful. So, to save ourselves stress and discomfort, we wait. And wait. And wait. Meanwhile, all the best people are still wondering, when are they going to do something about this? How long is this going to go on? Using data from Moody's company information reports, we were able to examine the pattern of turnover in the top management levels. We found no difference in the amount of turnover within a period of time between the good to great and the comparison companies. But we did find differences in the pattern of churn. 48. The good to great companies showed the following bipolar pattern at the top management level. People either stayed on the bus for a long time or got off the bus in a hurry. In other words, the good to great companies did not churn more, they churned better. The good to great leaders did not pursue an expedient, try a lot of people, and keep who works model of management. Instead, they adopted the following approach. Let's take the time to make rigorous A+ selections right up front. If we get it right, we'll do everything we can to try to keep them on board for a long time. If we make a mistake, then we'll confront that fact so that we can get on with our work and they can get on with their lives. The good to great leaders, however, would not rush to judgment. Often, they invested substantial effort in determining whether they had someone in the wrong seat before concluding that they had the wrong person on the bus entirely. When Coleman Mockler became CEO of Gillette, he didn't go on a rampage, wantonly throwing people out the windows of a moving bus. Instead, he spent fully 55% of his time during his first 2 years in office jiggering around with the management team, changing or moving 38 of the top 50 people. Said Mockler, every minute devoted to putting the proper person in the proper slot is worth weeks of time later. 49 Similarly, Alan Wurtzel of Circuit City sent us a letter after reading an early draft of this chapter, wherein he commented, "Your point about getting the right people on the bus as compared to other companies is dead on. There is one corollary that is also important. I spent a lot of time thinking and talking about who sits where on the bus. I called it putting square pegs in square holes and round pegs in round holes. Instead of firing honest and able people who are not performing well, it is important to try to move them once, or even 2 or 3 times to other positions where they might blossom. It might take time to know for certain if someone is simply in the wrong seat, or whether he needs to get off the bus altogether. Nonetheless, when the good to great leaders knew they had to make a people change, they would act. But how do you know when you know? 2 key questions can help. First, if it were a hiring decision, rather than a should this person get off the bus decision, would you hire the person again? Second, if the person came to tell you that he or she is leaving to pursue an exciting new opportunity, would you feel terribly disappointed or secretly relieved? Practical discipline number 3, put your best people on your biggest opportunities, not your biggest problems. In the early 1960s, R.J. Reynolds and Philip Morris derived the vast majority of their revenues from the domestic arena. R.J. Reynolds' approach to international business was, if somebody out there in the world wants a camel, let them call us. 50 Joe Coleman at Philip Morris had a different view. He identified international markets as the single best opportunity for long-term growth, despite the fact that the company derived less than 1% of its revenues from overseas. Coleman puzzled over the best strategy for developing international operations and eventually came up with a brilliant answer. It was not a what answer, but a who. He pulled his number 1 executive, George Weissman, off the primary domestic business and put him in charge of international. At the time, international amounted to almost nothing, a tiny export department, a struggling investment in Venezuela, another in Australia, and a tiny operation in Canada. When Joe put George in charge of international, a lot of people wondered what George had done wrong, quipped one of Weissman's colleagues. 51, I didn't know whether I was being thrown sideways, downstairs, or out the window, said Weissman. Here I was running 99% of the company, and the next day I'd be running 1% or less. 52. Yet, as Forbes magazine observed 20 years later, Coleman's decision to move Weissman to the smallest part of the business was a stroke of genius. Urbane and sophisticated, Weissman was the perfect person to develop markets like Europe, and he built international into the largest and fastest growing part of the company. In fact, under Weissman's stewardship, Marlboro became the best-selling cigarette in the world 3 years before it became number 1 in the United States. 53. The RJR versus Philip Morris case illustrates a common pattern. The good to great companies made a habit of putting their best people on their best opportunities, not their biggest problems. The comparison companies had a penchant for doing just the opposite, failing to grasp the fact that managing your problems can only make you good, whereas building your opportunities is the only way to become great. There is an important corollary to this discipline. When you decide to sell off your problems, don't sell off your best people. This is one of those little secrets of change. If you create a place where the best people always have a seat on the bus, they are more likely to support changes in direction. For instance, when Kimberly-Clark sold the mills, Darwin Smith made it clear, the company might be getting rid of the paper business, but it would keep its best people. Many of our people had come up through the paper business. Then, all of a sudden, the crown jewels are being sold off and they're asking, what is my future? Explained Dick Orchster. And Darwin would say, we need all the talented managers we can get. We keep them. 54 Despite the fact that they had little or no consumer experience, Smith moved all the best paper people to the consumer business. We interviewed Dick Appert, a senior executive who spent the majority of his career in the papermaking division at Kimberly-Clark, the same division sold off to create funds for the company's big move into consumer products. He talked with pride and excitement about the transformation of Kimberly-Clark, how it had the guts to sell the paper mills, how it had the foresight to exit the paper business and throw the proceeds into the consumer business, and how it had taken on Procter & Gamble. I never had any argument with our decision to dissolve the paper division of the company, he said. We did get rid of the paper mills at that time, and I was in absolute agreement with that. 55 Stop and think about that for a moment. The right people want to be part of building something great, and Dick Appert saw that Kimberly-Clark could become great by selling the part of the company where he had spent most of his working life. The Philip Morris and Kimberly-Clark cases illustrate a final point about the right people. We noticed a level 5 atmosphere at the top executive level of every good to great company, especially during the key transition years. Not that every executive on the team became a fully evolved level 5 leader to the same degree as Darwin Smith or Coleman Mockler, but each core member of the team transformed personal ambition into ambition for the company. This suggests that the team members had level 5 potential, or at least they were capable of operating in a manner consistent with the level 5 leadership style. You might be wondering, what's the difference between a level 5 executive team member and just being a good soldier? A level 5 executive team member does not blindly acquiesce to authority and is a strong leader in her own right, so driven and talented that she builds her arena into one of the very best in the world. Yet each team member must also have the ability to meld that strength into doing whatever it takes to make the company great. Indeed, one of the crucial elements in taking a company from good to great is somewhat paradoxical. You need executives, on the one hand, who argue and debate, sometimes violently, in pursuit of the best answers, yet, on the other hand, who unify fully behind a decision, regardless of parochial interests. An article on Philip Morris said of the Coleman era, these guys never agreed on anything and they would argue about everything, and they would kill each other and involve everyone, high and low, talented people. But when they had to make a decision, the decision would emerge. This made Philip Morris 56 no matter how much they argued, said a Philip Morris executive, they were always in search of the best answer. In the end, everybody stood behind the decision. All of the debates were for the common good of the company, not your own interests. 57. First two, great companies and a great life. Whenever I teach the good to great findings, someone almost always raises the issue of the personal cost in making a transition from good to great. In other words, is it possible to build a great company and also build a great life? Yes. The secret to doing so lies right in this chapter. I spent a few short days with a senior Gillette executive and his wife at an executive conference in Hong Kong. During the course of our conversations, I asked them if they thought Coleman Mockler, the CEO most responsible for Gillette's transition from good to great, had a great life. Coleman's life revolved around three great loves, they told me: his family, Harvard, and Gillette. Even during the darkest and most intense times of the takeover crises of the 1980s, and despite the increasingly global nature of Gillette's business, Mockler maintained remarkable balance in his life. He did not significantly reduce the amount of time he spent with his family, rarely working evenings or weekends. He maintained his disciplined worship practices. He continued his active work on the governing board of Harvard College. 58. When I asked how Mockler accomplished all of this, the executive said, "Oh, it really wasn't that hard for him. He was so good at assembling the right people around him and putting the right people in the right slots that he just didn't need to be there all hours of the day and night. That was Coleman's whole secret to success and balance." The executive went on to explain that he was just as likely to meet Mockler in the hardware store as at the office. He really enjoyed puttering around the house, fixing things up. He always seemed to find time to relax that way. Then the executive's wife added, "When Coleman died and we all went to the funeral, I looked around and realized how much love was in the room. This was a man who spent nearly all his waking hours with people who loved him, who loved what they were doing, and who loved one another, at work, at home, in his charitable work, wherever." And the statement rang a bell for me, as there was something about the good to great executive teams that I couldn't quite describe, but that clearly set them apart. In wrapping up our interview with George Weissman of Philip Morris, I commented, "When you talk about your time at the company, it's as if you are describing a love affair." He chuckled and said, "Yes. Other than my marriage, it was the passionate love affair of my life." I don't think many people would understand what I'm talking about, but I suspect my colleagues would. Weissman and many of his executive colleagues kept offices at Philip Morris, coming in on a regular basis, long after retirement. A corridor at the Philip Morris World headquarters is called the Hall of the Wizards of Woz. 59. It's the corridor where Weissman, Kuhlman, Maxwell, and others continue to come into the office, in large part, because they simply enjoy spending time together. Similarly, Dick Appert of Kimberly-Clark said in his interview, "I never had anyone in Kimberly-Clark, in all my 41 years, say anything unkind to me. I thank God the day I was hired, because I've been associated with wonderful people. Good people who respected and admired one another." 60. Members of the good to great teams tended to become and remain friends for life. In many cases, they are still in close contact with each other years or decades after working together. It was striking to hear them talk about the transition era, for no matter how dark the days, or how big the tasks, these people had fun. They enjoyed each other's company and actually looked forward to meetings. A number of the executives characterized their years on the good to great teams as the high point of their lives. Their experiences went beyond just mutual respect, which they certainly had, to lasting comradeship. Adherence to the idea of first who might be the closest link between a great company and a great life. For no matter what we achieve, if we don't spend the vast majority of our time with people we love and respect, we cannot possibly have a great life. But if we spend the vast majority of our time with people we love and respect, people we really enjoy being on the bus with and who will never disappoint us, then we will almost certainly have a great life, no matter where the bus goes. The people we interviewed from the good to great companies clearly loved what they did, largely because they loved who they did it with. Chapter summary: First who, then what? Key points. The good to great leaders began the transformation by first getting the right people on the bus and the wrong people off the bus, and then figured out where to drive it. The key point of this chapter is not just the idea of getting the right people on the team. The key point is that who questions come before what decisions, before vision, before strategy, before organization structure, before tactics. First who, then what, as a rigorous discipline, consistently applied. The comparison companies frequently followed the genius with 1,000 helpers model, a genius leader who sets a vision and then enlists a crew of highly capable helpers to make the vision happen. This model fails when the genius departs. The good to great leaders were rigorous, not ruthless, in people decisions. They did not rely on layoffs and restructuring as a primary strategy for improving performance. The comparison companies used layoffs to a much greater extent. We uncovered 3 practical disciplines for being rigorous in people decisions. 1. When in doubt, don't hire, keep looking. Corollary: a company should limit its growth based on its ability to attract enough of the right people. 2. When you know you need to make a people change, act. Corollary: first be sure you don't simply have someone in the wrong seat. 3. Put your best people on your biggest opportunities, not your biggest problems. Corollary: if you sell off your problems, don't sell off your best people. Good to great management teams consist of people who debate vigorously in search of the best answers, yet who unify behind decisions, regardless of parochial interests. Unexpected findings. We found no systematic pattern linking executive compensation to the shift from good to great. The purpose of compensation is not to motivate the right behaviors from the wrong people, but to get and keep the right people in the first place. The old adage, people are your most important asset, is wrong. People are not your most important asset. The right people are. Whether someone is the right person has more to do with character traits and innate capabilities than with specific knowledge, background, or skills. Chapter 4. Confront the brutal facts, yet never lose faith. There is no worse mistake in public leadership than to hold out false hopes soon to be swept away. Winston S. Churchill, The Hinge of Fate 1. In the early 1950s, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, commonly known as A&P, stood as the largest retailing organization in the world and one of the largest corporations in the United States, at one point ranking behind only General Motors in annual sales. Kroger, in contrast, stood as an unspectacular grocery chain, less than half the size of A&P, with performance that barely kept pace with the general market. Then in the 1960s, A&P began to falter while Kroger began to lay the foundations for a transition into a great company. From 1959 to 1973, both companies lagged behind the market, with Kroger pulling just a bit ahead of A&P. After that, the two companies completely diverged, and over the next 25 years, Kroger generated cumulative returns 10 times the market and 80 times better than A&P. How did such a dramatic reversal of fortunes happen? And how could a company as great as A&P become so awful? Notes. 1. Kroger transition point occurred in 1973. 2. Chart shows value of $1 invested on January 1, 1959. 3. Cumulative returns, dividends reinvested, to January 1, 1973. Notes. 1. Kroger transition point occurred in 1973. 2. Chart shows value of $1 invested on January 1, 1973. 3. Cumulative returns, dividends reinvested, to January 1, 1998. A&P had a perfect model for the first half of the 20th century, when 2 world wars and a depression imposed frugality upon Americans, cheap, plentiful groceries sold in utilitarian stores. But in the affluent second half of the 20th century, Americans changed. They wanted nicer stores, bigger stores, more choices in stores. They wanted fresh baked bread, flowers, health foods, cold medicines, fresh produce, 4 to 5 choices of cereal, and 10 types of milk. They wanted offbeat items, like 5 different types of expensive sprouts and various concoctions of protein powder and Chinese healing herbs. Oh, and they wanted to be able to do their banking and get their annual flu shots while shopping. In short, they no longer wanted grocery stores. They wanted superstores, with a big block S on the chest, offering almost everything under one roof, with lots of parking, cheap prices, clean floors, and a gazillion checkout lines. Now, right off the bat, you might be thinking, okay, so the story of A&P is one of an aging company that had a strategy that was right for the times, but the times changed and the world passed it by as younger, better-tuned companies gave customers more of what they wanted. What's so interesting about that? Here's what's interesting. Both Kroger and A&P were old companies, Kroger at 82 years, A&P at 111 years. Heading into the 1970s, both companies had nearly all their assets invested in traditional grocery stores. Both companies had strongholds outside the major growth areas of the United States, and both companies had knowledge of how the world around them was changing. Yet one of these two companies confronted the brutal facts of reality head-on and completely changed its entire system in response. The other stuck its head in the sand. In 1958, Forbes magazine described A&P as the hermit kingdom, run as an absolute monarchy by an aging prince. 3. Ralph Burger, the successor to the Hartford brothers who had built the A&P dynasty, sought to preserve two things. Above all else, cash dividends for the family foundation and the past glory of the Hartford brothers. According to one A&P director, Burger considered himself the reincarnation of old John Hartford, even to the point of wearing a flower in his lapel every day from Hartford's greenhouse. He tried to carry out, against all opposition, what he thought Mr. John Hartford would have liked. For Burger instilled a what would Mr. Hartford do approach to decisions, living by the motto, you can't argue with 100 years of success. 5. Indeed, through Burger, Mr. Hartford continued to be the dominant force on the board for nearly 20 years. Never mind the fact that he was already dead. 6. As the brutal facts about the mismatch between its past model and the changing world began to pile up, A&P mounted an increasingly spirited defense against those facts. In one series of events, the company opened a new store called the Golden Key, a separate brand wherein it could experiment with new methods and models to learn what customers wanted. 7. It sold no A&P branded products. It gave the store manager more freedom, it experimented with innovative new departments, and it began to evolve toward the modern superstore. Customers really liked it. Here, right under their noses, they began to discover the answer to the questions of why they were losing market share and what they could do about it. What did A&P executives do with the Golden Key? They didn't like the answers that it gave, so they closed it. 8. A&P then began a pattern of lurching from one strategy to another, always looking for a single-stroke solution to its problems. It held pep rallies, launched programs, grabbed fads, fired CEOs, hired CEOs, and fired them yet again. It launched what one industry observer called a scorched earth policy, a radical price-cutting strategy to build market share, but never dealt with the basic fact that customers wanted not lower prices, but different stores. 9. The price cutting led to cost cutting, which led to even drabber stores and poorer service, which in turn drove customers away, further driving down margins, resulting in even dirtier stores and worse service. After a while the crud kept mounting, said one former A&P manager. We not only had dirt, we had dirty dirt. 10. Meanwhile, over at Kroger, a completely different pattern arose. Kroger also conducted experiments in the 1960s to test the superstore concept. 11. By 1970, the Kroger executive team came to an inescapable conclusion. The old model grocery store, which accounted for nearly 100% of Kroger's business, was going to become extinct. Unlike A&P, however, Kroger confronted this brutal truth and acted on it. The rise of Kroger is remarkably simple and straightforward, almost maddeningly so. During their interviews, Lyle Everingham and his predecessor Jim Herring, CEOs during the pivotal transition years, were polite and helpful, but a bit exasperated by our questions. To them, it just seemed so clear. When we asked Everingham to allocate 100 points across the top 5 factors in the transition, he said, I find your question a bit perplexing. Basically, we did extensive research, and the data came back loud and clear. The super combination stores were the way of the future. We also learned that you had to be number 1 or number 2 in each market, or you had to exit. Asterisk sure, there was some skepticism at first. But once we looked at the facts, there was really no question about what we had to do. So we just did it. 12. Kroger decided to eliminate, change, or replace every single store and depart every region that did not fit the new realities. The whole system would be turned inside out, store by store, block by block, city by city, state by state. By the early 1990s, Kroger had rebuilt its entire system on the new model, and was well on the way to becoming the number 1 grocery chain in America, a position it would attain in 1999. 13. Meanwhile, A&P still had over half its stores in the old 1950 size, and had dwindled to a sad remnant of a once great American institution. 14. Facts are better than dreams. One of the dominant themes from our research is that breakthrough results come about by a series of good decisions, diligently executed and accumulated one on top of another. Of course, the good to great companies did not have a perfect track record. But on the whole, they made many more good decisions than bad ones, and they made many more good decisions than the comparison companies. Even more important, on the really big choices, such as Kroger's decision to throw all its resources into the task of converting its entire system to the superstore concept, they were remarkably on target. This, of course, begs a question. Are we merely studying a set of companies that just happened by luck to stumble into the right set of decisions? Or was there something distinctive about their process that dramatically increased the likelihood of being right? The answer, it turns out, is that there was something quite distinctive about their process. The good to great companies displayed 2 distinctive forms of disciplined thought. The first, and the topic of this chapter, is that they infused the entire process with the brutal facts of reality. The second, which we will discuss in the next chapter, is that they developed a simple, yet deeply insightful, frame of reference for all decisions. When, as in the Kroger case, you start with an honest and diligent effort to determine the truth of the situation, the right decisions often become self-evident. Not always, of course, but often. And even if all decisions do not become self-evident, one thing is certain, you absolutely cannot make a series of good decisions without first confronting the brutal facts. The good to great companies operated in accordance with this principle, and the comparison companies generally did not. Consider Pitney Bowes versus Addressograph. It would be hard to find two companies in more similar positions at a specific moment in history that then diverged so dramatically. Until 1973, they had similar revenues, profits, numbers of employees, and stock charts. Both companies held near-monopoly market positions with virtually the same customer base, Pitney Bowes in postage meters and Addressograph in address duplicating machines, and both faced the imminent reality of losing their monopolies. 15 by 2000, however, Pitney Bowes had grown to over 30,000 employees and revenues in excess of $4 billion, compared to the sorry remnants of Addressograph, which had less than $100 million and only 670 employees. 16 for the shareholder, Pitney Bowes outperformed Addressograph 3,581 to 1, yes, 3,581 times better. In 1976, a charismatic visionary leader named Roy Ashe became CEO of Addressograph. A self-described conglomerateur, Ashe had previously built Litton by stacking acquisitions together that had since faltered. According to Fortune, he sought to use Addressograph as a platform to re-establish his leadership prowess in the eyes of the world. 17. Ashe set forth a vision to dominate the likes of IBM, Xerox, and Kodak in the emerging field of office automation, a bold plan for a company that had previously only dominated the envelope address duplication business. 18. There is nothing wrong with a bold vision, but Ashe became so wedded to his quixotic quest that, according to Business Week, he refused to confront the mounting evidence that his plan was doomed to fail and might take down the rest of the company with it. 19. He insisted on milking cash from profitable arenas, eroding the core business while throwing money after a gambit that had little chance of success. 20. Later, after Ashe was thrown out of office and the company had filed for bankruptcy, from which it did later emerge, he still refused to confront reality, saying, "We lost some battles, but we were winning the war." 21. But Addressograph was not even close to winning the war, and people throughout the company knew it at the time. Yet the truth went unheard until it was too late. 22. In fact, many of Addressograp's key people bailed out of the company, dispirited by their inability to get top management to deal with the facts. 23. Perhaps we should give Mr. Ashe some credit for being a visionary who tried to push his company to greater heights. And to be fair, the Addressograph board fired Ashe before he had a chance to fully carry out his plans. 24. But the evidence from a slew of respectable articles written at the time suggests that Ashe turned a blind eye to any reality inconsistent with his own vision of the world. There is nothing wrong with pursuing a vision for greatness. After all, the good to great companies also set out to create greatness. But unlike the comparison companies, the good to great companies continually refined the path to greatness with the brutal facts of reality. When you turn over rocks and look at all the squiggly things underneath, you can either put the rock down, or you can say, "My job is to turn over rocks and look at the squiggly things, even if what you see can scare the hell out of you." 25. That quote, from Pitney Bowes executive Fred Perdue, could have come from any of the Pitney Bowes executives we interviewed. They all seemed a bit, well, to be blunt, neurotic and compulsive about Pitney's position in the world. "This is a culture that is very hostile to complacency," said one executive. 26. We have an itch that what we just accomplished, no matter how great, is never going to be good enough to sustain us, said another. 27. Pitney's first management meeting of the new year typically consisted of about 15 minutes discussing the previous year, almost always superb results, and 2 hours talking about the scary squiggly things that might impede future results. 28. Pitney Bowes sales meetings were quite different from the "aren't we great" rah-rah sales conferences typical at most companies. The entire management team would lay itself open to searing questions and challenges from salespeople who dealt directly with customers. 29. The company created a long-standing tradition of forums where people could stand up and tell senior executives what the company was doing wrong, shoving rocks with squiggly things in their faces and saying, "Look, you'd better pay attention to this." 30. The Addressograph case, especially in contrast to Pitney Bowes, illustrates a vital point. Strong, charismatic leaders like Roy Ashe can all too easily become the de facto reality driving a company. Throughout the study, we found comparison companies where the top leader led with such force, or instilled such fear that people worried more about the leader, what he would say, what he would think, what he would do, than they worried about external reality and what it could do to the company. Recall the climate at Bank of America, described in the previous chapter, wherein managers would not even make a comment until they knew how the CEO felt. We did not find this pattern at companies like Wells Fargo and Pitney Bowes, where people were much more worried about the scary squiggly things than about the feelings of top management. The moment a leader allows himself to become the primary reality people worry about, rather than reality being the primary reality, you have a recipe for mediocrity, or worse. This is one of the key reasons why less charismatic leaders often produce better long-term results than their more charismatic counterparts. Indeed, for those of you with a strong, charismatic personality, it is worthwhile to consider the idea that charisma can be as much a liability as an asset. Your strength of personality can sow the seeds of problems when people filter the brutal facts from you. You can overcome the liabilities of having charisma, but it does require conscious attention. Winston Churchill understood the liabilities of his strong personality, and he compensated for them beautifully during the Second World War. Churchill, as you know, maintained a bold and unwavering vision that Britain would not just survive, but prevail as a great nation, despite the whole world wondering not if, but when Britain would sue for peace. During the darkest days, with nearly all of Europe and North Africa under Nazi control, the United States hoping to stay out of the conflict, and Hitler fighting a one-front war, he had not yet turned on Russia, Churchill said. "We are resolved to destroy Hitler and every vestige of the Nazi regime. From this, nothing will turn us. Nothing. We will never parley. We will never negotiate with Hitler or any of his gang. We shall fight him by land. We shall fight him by sea. We shall fight him in the air. Until, with God's help, we have rid the earth of his shadow." 31. Armed with this bold vision, Churchill never failed, however, to confront the most brutal facts. He feared that his towering, charismatic personality might deter bad news from reaching him in its starkest form. So, early in the war, he created an entirely separate department outside the normal chain of command, called the Statistical Office, with the principal function of feeding him, continuously updated and completely unfiltered, the most brutal facts of reality. 32. He relied heavily on this special unit throughout the war, repeatedly asking for facts, just the facts. As the Nazi panzers swept across Europe, Churchill went to bed and slept soundly. "I'd had no need for cheering dreams," he wrote. Facts are better than dreams. 33. A climate where the truth is heard. Now, you might be wondering, how do you motivate people with brutal facts? Doesn't motivation flow chiefly from a compelling vision? The answer, surprisingly, is no. Not because vision is unimportant, but because expending energy trying to motivate people is largely a waste of time. One of the dominant themes that runs throughout this book is that if you successfully implement its findings, you will not need to spend time and energy motivating people. If you have the right people on the bus, they will be self-motivated. The real question then becomes, how do you manage in such a way as not to demotivate people? And one of the single most demotivating actions you can take is to hold out false hopes, soon to be swept away by events. Yes, leadership is about vision. But leadership is equally about creating a climate where the truth is heard and the brutal facts confronted. There's a huge difference between the opportunity to have your say and the opportunity to be heard. The good to great leaders understood this distinction, creating a culture wherein people had a tremendous opportunity to be heard and, ultimately, for the truth to be heard. How do you create a climate where the truth is heard? We offer 4 basic practices. 1. Lead with questions, not answers. In 1973, 1 year after he assumed CEO responsibility from his father, Alan Wurtzel's company stood at the brink of bankruptcy, dangerously close to violation of its loan agreements. At the time, the company, then named Ward's, not to be confused with Montgomery Ward, was a hodgepodge of appliance and hi-fi stores with no unifying concept. Over the next 10 years, Wurtzel and his team not only turned the company around, but also created the Circuit City concept and laid the foundations for a stunning record of results, beating the market 22 times from its transition date in 1982 to January 1, 2000. When Alan Wurtzel started the long traverse from near bankruptcy to these stellar results, he began with a remarkable answer to the question of where to take the company. I don't know. Unlike leaders such as Roy Ash of Adressograph, Wurtzel resisted the urge to walk in with the answer. Instead, once he put the right people on the bus, he began not with answers, but with questions. Alan was a real spark, said a board member. He had an ability to ask questions that were just marvelous. We had some wonderful debates in the boardroom. It was never just a dog and pony show, where you would just listen and then go to lunch. 34 indeed, Wurtzel stands as one of the few CEOs in a large corporation who put more questions to his board members than they put to him. He used the same approach with his executive team, constantly pushing and probing and prodding with questions. Each step along the way, Wurtzel would keep asking questions until he had a clear picture of reality and its implications. They used to call me the prosecutor, because I would home in on a question, said Wurtzel. You know, like a bulldog, I wouldn't let go until I understood. Why? Like Wurtzel, leaders in each of the good to great transitions operated with a somewhat Socratic style. Furthermore, they used questions for one, and only one reason, to gain understanding. They didn't use questions as a form of manipulation, don't you agree with me on that? Or as a way to blame or put down others, why did you mess this up? When we asked the executives about their management team meetings during the transition era, they said that they spent much of the time just trying to understand. The good to great leaders made particularly good use of informal meetings where they'd meet with groups of managers and employees with no script, agenda, or set of action items to discuss. Instead, they would start with questions like, so, what's on your mind? Can you tell me about that? Can you help me understand? What should we be worried about? These non-agenda meetings became a forum where current realities tended to bubble to the surface. Leading from good to great does not mean coming up with the answers and then motivating everyone to follow your messianic vision. It means having the humility to grasp the fact that you do not yet understand enough to have the answers, and then to ask the questions that will lead to the best possible insights. 2. Engage in dialogue and debate, not coercion. In 1965, you could hardly find a company more awful than Nucor. It had only one division that made money. Everything else drained cash. It had no culture to be proud of. It had no consistent direction. It was on the verge of bankruptcy. At the time, Nucor was officially known as the Nuclear Corporation of America, reflecting its orientation to nuclear energy products, including the scintillation probe. Yes, they really named it that, used for radiation measurement. It had acquired a series of unrelated businesses in such arenas as semiconductor supplies, rare earth materials, electrostatic office copiers, and roof joists. At the start of its transformation in 1965, Nucor did not manufacture 1 ounce of steel. Nor did it make a penny of profit. 30 years later, Nucor stood as the 4th largest steelmaker in the world, 35, and by 1999 made greater annual profits than any other American steel company. 36. How did Nucor transition from the utterly awful Nuclear Corporation of America into perhaps the best steel company in America? First, Nucor benefited from the emergence of a level 5 leader, Ken Iverson, promoted to CEO from general manager of the Joist division. Second, Iverson got the right people on the bus, building a remarkable team of people like Sam Siegel, described by one of his colleagues as the best money manager in the world, a magician, and David Aycock, an operations genius. 37. And then what? Like Alan Wurtzel, Iverson dreamed of building a great company, but refused to begin with the answer for how to get there. Instead, he played the role of Socratic moderator in a series of raging debates. We established an ongoing series of general manager meetings, and my role was more as a mediator, commented Iverson. They were chaos. We would stay there for hours, ironing out the issues, until we came to something. At times, the meetings would get so violent that people almost went across the table at each other. People yelled. They waved their arms around and pounded on tables. Faces would get red and veins bulged out. 38. Iverson's assistant tells of a scene repeated over the years, wherein colleagues would march into Iverson's office and yell and scream at each other, but then emerge with a conclusion. 39. Argue and debate, then sell the nuclear business, argue and debate, then focus on steel joists, argue and debate, then begin to manufacture their own steel, argue and debate, then invest in their own mini mill, argue and debate, then build a second mini mill, and so forth. Nearly all the Nucor executives we spoke with described a climate of debate, wherein the company's strategy evolved through many agonizing arguments and fights. 40. Like Nucor, all the good to great companies had a penchant for intense dialogue. Phrases like loud debate, heated discussions, and healthy conflict peppered the articles and interview transcripts from all the companies. They didn't use discussion as a sham process to let people have their say, so that they could buy into a predetermined decision. The process was more like a heated scientific debate, with people engaged in a search for the best answers. 3. Conduct autopsies without blame. In 1978, Philip Morris acquired the 7-Up company, only to sell it 8 years later at a loss. 41. The financial loss was relatively small compared to Philip Morris's total assets, but it was a highly visible black eye that consumed thousands of hours of precious management time. In our interviews with the Philip Morris executives, we were struck by how they all brought up the debacle on their own and discussed it openly. Instead of hiding their big, ugly mistake, they seemed to feel an almost therapeutic need to talk about it. In his book, I'm a Lucky Guy, Joe Coleman dedicates 5 pages to dissecting the 7UP disaster. He doesn't hold back the embarrassing truth about how flawed the decision was. It is a 5-page clinical analysis of the mistake, its implications, and its lessons. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people hours had been spent in autopsies of the 7UP case. Yet, as much as they talked about this conspicuous failure, no one pointed fingers to single out blame. There is only one exception to this pattern, Joe Coleman, standing in front of the mirror, pointing the finger right at himself. It became apparent that this was another Joe Coleman plan that didn't work, he writes. 42 He goes even further, implying that if he'd only listened better to the people who challenged his idea at the time, the disaster might have been averted. He goes out of his way to give credit to those who were right in retrospect, naming those specific individuals who were more prescient than himself. In an era when leaders go to great lengths to preserve the image of their own track record, stepping forth to claim credit about how they were visionary when their colleagues were not, but finding others to blame when their decisions go awry, it is quite refreshing to come across Coleman. He set the tone. I will take responsibility for this bad decision. But we will all take responsibility for extracting the maximum learning from the tuition we've paid. When you conduct autopsies without blame, you go a long way toward creating a climate where the truth is heard. If you have the right people on the bus, you should almost never need to assign blame, but need only to search for understanding and learning. 4. Build red flag mechanisms. We live in an information age, when those with more and better information supposedly have an advantage. If you look across the rise and fall of organizations, however, you will rarely find companies stumbling because they lacked information. Bethlehem Steel executives had known for years about the threat of mini-mill companies like Nuka. They paid little attention until they woke up one day to discover large chunks of market share taken away. 43. Upjohn had plenty of information that indicated some of its forthcoming products would fail to deliver anticipated results or, worse, had potentially serious side effects. Yet it often ignored those problems. With Halcyon, for example, an insider was quoted in Newsweek saying, dismissing safety concerns about Halcyon had become virtual company policy. In another case, when Upjohn found itself under fire, it framed its problems as adverse publicity, rather than confronting the truth of its own shortcomings. 44. Executives at Bank of America had plenty of information about the realities of deregulation, yet they failed to confront the one big implication of those realities. In a deregulated world, banking would be a commodity, and the old perks and genteel traditions of banking would be gone forever. Not until it had lost $1.8 billion did Bank of America fully accept this fact. In contrast, Carl Reichert of Wells Fargo, called the ultimate realist by his predecessor, hit the brutal facts of deregulation head-on. 45 Sorry, fellow bankers, but we can preserve the banker class no more. We've got to be businessmen with as much attention to costs and effectiveness as McDonald's. Indeed, we found no evidence that the good to great companies had more or better information than the comparison companies. None. Both sets of companies had virtually identical access to good information. The key, then, lies not in better information, but in turning information into information that cannot be ignored. One particularly powerful way to accomplish this is through red flag mechanisms. Allow me to use a personal example to illustrate the idea. When teaching by the case method at Stanford Business School, I issued to each MBA student an 8.5-inch by 11-inch bright red sheet of paper with the following instructions. This is your red flag for the quarter. If you raise your hand with your red flag, the classroom will stop for you. There are no restrictions on when and how to use your red flag. The decision rests entirely in your hands. You can use it to voice an observation, share a personal experience, present an analysis, disagree with the professor, challenge a CEO guest, respond to a fellow student, ask a question, make a suggestion, or whatever. There will be no penalty whatsoever for any use of a red flag. Your red flag can be used only once during the quarter. Your red flag is non-transferable. You cannot give or sell it to another student. With the red flag, I had no idea precisely what would happen each day in class. In one situation, a student used her red flag to state, Professor Collins, I think you are doing a particularly ineffective job of running class today. You are leading too much with your questions and stifling our independent thinking. Let us think for ourselves. The red flag confronted me with the brutal fact that my own questioning style stood in the way of people's learning. A student survey at the end of the quarter would have given me that same information. But the red flag, real time, in front of everyone in the classroom, turned information about the shortcomings of the class into information that I absolutely could not ignore. I got the idea for red flag mechanisms from Bruce Woolpert, who instituted a particularly powerful device called Short Pay at his company Granite Rock. Short Pay gives the customer full discretionary power to decide whether and how much to pay on an invoice based upon his own subjective evaluation of how satisfied he feels with a product or service. Short Pay is not a refund policy. The customer does not need to return the product, nor does he need to call Granite Rock for permission. He simply circles the offending item on the invoice, deducts it from the total, and sends a check for the balance. When I asked Woolpert his reasons for Short Pay, he said, you can get a lot of information from customer surveys, but there are always ways of explaining away the data. With Short Pay, you absolutely have to pay attention to the data. You often don't know that a customer is upset until you lose that customer entirely. Short Pay acts as an early warning system that forces us to adjust quickly, long before we would lose that customer. To be clear, we did not generally find red flag mechanisms as vivid and dramatic as Short Pay in the good to great companies. Nonetheless, I've decided to include this idea here, at the urging of research assistant Lane Hornung. Hornung, who helped me systematically research and collate mechanisms across companies for a different research project, makes the compelling argument that if you're a fully developed level 5 leader, you might not need red flag mechanisms. But if you are not yet a level 5 leader, or if you suffer the liability of charisma, red flag mechanisms give you a practical and useful tool for turning information into information that cannot be ignored and for creating a climate where the truth is heard. Asterisk. Unwavering faith amid the brutal facts. When Procter & Gamble invaded the paper-based consumer business in the late 1960s, Scott Paper, then the leader, simply resigned itself to second place without a fight and began looking for ways to diversify. 46. The company had a meeting for analysts in 1971 that was one of the most depressing I've ever attended, said one analyst. Management essentially threw in the towel and said, we've been had. 47. The once proud company began to look at its competition and say, here's how we stack up against the best, and sigh, oh, well, at least there are people in the business worse than we are. 48. Instead of figuring out how to get back on the offensive and win, Scott just tried to protect what it had. Conceding the top end of the market to P&G, Scott hoped that, by hiding away in the B category, it would be left alone by the big monster that had invaded its turf. 49. Kimberly-Clark, on the other hand, viewed competing against Procter & Gamble not as a liability, but as an asset. Darwin Smith and his team felt exhilarated by the idea of going up against the best, seeing it as an opportunity to make Kimberly-Clark better and stronger. They also viewed it as a way to stimulate the competitive juices of Kimberly people at all levels. At one internal gathering, Darwin Smith stood up and started his talk by saying, okay, I want everyone to rise in a moment of silence. Everyone looked around, wondering what Darwin was up to. Did someone die? And so, after a moment of confusion, they all stood up and stared at their shoes in reverent silence. After an appropriate pause, Smith looked out at the group and said in a somber tone, that was a moment of silence for P&G. The place went bananas. Blair White, a director who witnessed the incident, said, he had everyone wound up in this thing, all up and down the company. Right down to the plant floor. We were taking on Goliath. 50 later, Wayne Sanders, Smith's successor, described to us the incredible benefit of competing against the best. Could we have a better adversary than P&G? Not a chance. I say that because we respect them so much. They are bigger than we are. They are very talented. They are great at marketing. They beat the hell out of every one of their competitors, except one, Kimberly-Clark. That is one of the things that makes us so proud. 51. Scott Paper's and Kimberly-Clark's differing reactions to P&G bring us to a vital point. In confronting the brutal facts, the good to great companies left themselves stronger and more resilient, not weaker and more dispirited. There is a sense of exhilaration that comes in facing head on the hard truths and saying, we will never give up. We will never capitulate. It might take a long time, but we will find a way to prevail. Robert Adders of Kroger summed this up nicely at the end of his interview, describing the psychology of the Kroger team as it faced the daunting 20-year task of methodically turning over the entire Kroger system. There was a certain Churchillian character to what we were doing. We had a very strong will to live, the sense that we are Kroger. Kroger was here before and will be here long after we are gone, and by God, we are going to win this thing. It might take us 100 years, but we will persist for 100 years, if that's what it takes. 52. Throughout our research, we were continually reminded of the hardness research studies done by the International Committee for the Study of Victimization. These studies looked at people who had suffered serious adversity, cancer patients, prisoners of war, accident victims, and so forth, and survived. They found that people fell generally into 3 categories: those who were permanently dispirited by the event, those who got their life back to normal, and those who used the experience as a defining event that made them stronger. 53. The good to great companies were like those in the third group, with the hardness factor. When Fannie Mae began its transition in the early 1980s, almost no one gave it high odds for success, much less for greatness. Fannie Mae had $56 billion of loans that were losing money. It received about 9% interest on its mortgage portfolio, but had to pay up to 15% on the debt it issued. Multiply that difference times $56 billion, and you get a very large negative number. Furthermore, by charter, Fannie Mae could not diversify outside the mortgage finance business. Most people viewed Fannie Mae as totally beholden to shifts in the direction of interest rates. They go up and Fannie Mae loses, they go down and Fannie Mae wins, and many believed that Fannie Mae could succeed only if the government stepped in to clamp down on interest rates. 54. That's their only hope, said one analyst. 55. But that's not the way David Maxwell and his newly assembled team viewed the situation. They never wavered in their faith, consistently emphasizing in their interviews with us that they never had the goal to merely survive, but to prevail in the end as a great company. Yes, the interest spread was a brutal fact that was not going to magically disappear. Fannie Mae had no choice but to become the best capital markets player in the world at managing mortgage interest risk. Maxwell and his team set out to create a new business model that would depend much less on interest rates, involving the invention of very sophisticated mortgage finance instruments. Most analysts responded with derision. When you've got $56 billion worth of loans in place and underwater, talking about new programs is a joke, said one. That's like Chrysler, then asking for federal loan guarantees to stave off bankruptcy, going into the aircraft business. 56. After completing my interview with David Maxwell, I asked how he and his team dealt with the naysayers during those dark days. It was never an issue internally, he said. Of course, we had to stop doing a lot of stupid things, and we had to invent a completely new set of financial devices. But we never entertained the possibility that we would fail. We were going to use the calamity as an opportunity to remake Fannie Mae into a great company. 57. During a research meeting, a team member commented that Fannie Mae reminded her of an old television show, The $6 Million Man with Lee Majors. The pretext of the series is that an astronaut suffers a serious crash while testing a moon landing craft over a southwestern desert. Instead of just trying to save the patient, doctors completely redesign him into a superhuman cyborg, installing atomic-powered robotic devices such as a powerful left eye and mechanical limbs. 58. Similarly, David Maxwell and his team didn't use the fact that Fannie Mae was bleeding and near death as a pretext to merely restructure the company. They used it as an opportunity to create something much stronger and more powerful. Step by step, day by day, month by month, the Fannie Mae team rebuilt the entire business model around risk management and reshaped the corporate culture into a high-performance machine that rivaled anything on Wall Street, eventually generating stock returns nearly 8 times the market over 15 years. The Stockdale Paradox. Of course, not all good to great companies faced a dire crisis like Fannie Mae, fewer than half did. But every good to great company faced significant adversity along the way to greatness, of one sort or another. Gillette and the takeover battles, Nuka and imports, Wells Fargo and deregulation, Pitney Bowes losing its monopoly, Abbott Labs and a huge product recall, Kroger and the need to replace nearly 100% of its stores, and so forth. In every case, the management team responded with a powerful psychological duality. On the one hand, they stoically accepted the brutal facts of reality. On the other hand, they maintained an unwavering faith in the endgame and a commitment to prevail as a great company despite the brutal facts. We came to call this duality the Stockdale Paradox. The name refers to Admiral Jim Stockdale, who was the highest-ranking United States military officer in the Hanoi Hilton prisoner of war camp during the height of the Vietnam War. Tortured over 20 times during his 8-year imprisonment from 1965 to 1973, Stockdale lived out the war without any prisoner's rights, no set release date, and no certainty as to whether he would even survive to see his family again. He shouldered the burden of command, doing everything he could to create conditions that would increase the number of prisoners who would survive unbroken, while fighting an internal war against his captors and their attempts to use the prisoners for propaganda. At one point, he beat himself with a stool and cut himself with a razor, deliberately disfiguring himself, so that he could not be put on videotape as an example of a well-treated prisoner. He exchanged secret intelligence information with his wife through their letters, knowing that discovery would mean more torture and perhaps death. He instituted rules that would help people to deal with torture. No one can resist torture indefinitely, so he created a stepwise system after X minutes. You can say certain things that gave the men milestones to survive toward. He instituted an elaborate internal communications system to reduce the sense of isolation that their captors tried to create, which used a 5x5 matrix of tap codes for alpha characters. Tap tap equals the letter A, tap pause tap tap equals the letter B, tap tap pause tap equals the letter F, and so forth, for 25 letters, C doubling in for K. At one point, during an imposed silence, the prisoners mopped and swept the central yard using the code, swish-swashing out, "We love you," to Stockdale, on the 3rd anniversary of his being shot down. After his release, Stockdale became the first 3-star officer in the history of the Navy to wear both aviator wings and the Congressional Medal of Honor. 59. You can understand, then, my anticipation at the prospect of spending part of an afternoon with Stockdale. One of my students had written his paper on Stockdale, who happened to be a senior research fellow studying the Stoic philosophers at the Hoover Institution right across the street from my office, and Stockdale invited the two of us for lunch. In preparation, I read In Love and War, the book Stockdale and his wife had written in alternating chapters, chronicling their experiences during those 8 years. As I moved through the book, I found myself getting depressed. It just seemed so bleak, the uncertainty of his fate, the brutality of his captors, and so forth. And then, it dawned on me, here I'm sitting in my warm and comfortable office, looking out over the beautiful Stanford campus on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. I'm getting depressed reading this, and I know the end of the story. I know that he gets out, reunites with his family, becomes a national hero, and gets to spend the later years of his life studying philosophy on this same beautiful campus. If it feels depressing for me, how on earth did he deal with it when he was actually there and did not know the end of the story? I never lost faith in the end of the story, he said, when I asked him. I never doubted not only that I would get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into the defining event of my life, which, in retrospect, I would not trade. Asterisk. I didn't say anything for many minutes, and we continued the slow walk toward the faculty club, Stockdale limping and Ark swinging his stiff leg that had never fully recovered from repeated torture. Finally, after about 100 meters of silence, I asked, who didn't make it out? Oh, that's easy, he said. The optimists. The optimists. I don't understand, I said, now completely confused, given what he'd said 100 meters earlier. The optimists. Oh, they were the ones who said, we're going to be out by Christmas. And Christmas would come, and Christmas would go. Then they'd say, we're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come, and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart. Another long pause, and more walking. Then he turned to me and said, this is a very important lesson. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. To this day, I carry a mental image of Stockdale admonishing the optimists, we're not getting out by Christmas, deal with it. Asterisk. That conversation with Admiral Stockdale stayed with me, and in fact had a profound influence on my own development. Life is unfair, sometimes to our advantage, sometimes to our disadvantage. We will all experience disappointments and crushing events somewhere along the way, setbacks for which there is no reason, no one to blame. It might be disease, it might be injury, it might be an accident, it might be losing a loved one, it might be getting swept away in a political shakeup, it might be getting shot down over Vietnam and thrown into a POW camp for 8 years. What separates people, Stockdale taught me, is not the presence or absence of difficulty, but how they deal with the inevitable difficulties of life. In wrestling with life's challenges, the Stockdale paradox, you must retain faith that you will prevail in the end and you must also confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, has proved powerful for coming back from difficulties, not weakened, but stronger, not just for me, but for all those who've learned the lesson and tried to apply it. I never really considered my walk with Stockdale as part of my research into great companies, categorizing it more as a personal rather than corporate lesson. But as we unraveled the research evidence, I kept coming back to it in my own mind. Finally, one day during a research team meeting, I shared the Stockdale story. There was silence around the table when I finished, and I thought, they must think I'm really out in left field. Then Dwayne Duffy, a quiet and thoughtful team member, who had done the A&P versus Kroger analysis, said, that's exactly what I've been struggling with. I've been trying to get my hands around the essential difference between A&P and Kroger. And that's it. Kroger was like Stockdale, and A&P was like the optimists, who always thought they'd be out by Christmas. Then other team members began to chime in, noting the same difference between their comparison sets. Wells Fargo versus Bank of America both facing deregulation, Kimberly-Clark versus Scott Paper both facing the terrible might of Procter & Gamble, Pitney Bowes versus Adressagraph both facing the loss of their monopolies, Nuka versus Bethlehem Steel both facing imports, and so forth. They all demonstrated this paradoxical psychological pattern, and we dubbed it the Stockdale paradox. The Stockdale paradox is a signature of all those who create greatness, be it in leading their own lives or in leading others. Churchill had it during the Second World War. Admiral Stockdale, like Viktor Frankl before him, lived it in a prison camp. And while our good to great companies cannot claim to have experienced either the grandeur of saving the free world or the depth of personal experience of living in a POW camp, they all embraced the Stockdale paradox. It didn't matter how bleak the situation or how stultifying their mediocrity, they all maintained unwavering faith that they would not just survive, but prevail as a great company. And yet, at the same time, they became relentlessly disciplined at confronting the most brutal facts of their current reality. Like much of what we found in our research, the key elements of greatness are deceptively simple and straightforward. The good to great leaders were able to strip away so much noise and clutter, and just focus on the few things that would have the greatest impact. They were able to do so in large part because they operated from both sides of the Stockdale paradox, never letting one side overshadow the other. If you are able to adopt this dual pattern, you will dramatically increase the odds of making a series of good decisions and ultimately discovering a simple, yet deeply insightful, concept for making the really big choices. And once you have that simple, unifying concept, you will be very close to making a sustained transition to breakthrough results. It is to the creation of that concept that we now turn. Asterisk, keep in mind, this was the early 1970s, a full decade before the number one, number two, or exit idea became mainstream. Kroger, like all good to great companies, developed its ideas by paying attention to the data right in front of it, not by following trends and fads set by others. Interestingly, over half the good to great companies had some version of the number one, number two concept in place years before it became a management fad. Asterisk, for a more complete discussion of mechanisms, see the article Turning Goals into Results, The Power of Catalytic Mechanisms, Harvard Business Review, July-August, 1999. Chapter summary: confront the brutal facts, yet never lose faith. Key points. All good to great companies began the process of finding a path to greatness by confronting the brutal facts of their current reality. When you start with an honest and diligent effort to determine the truth of your situation, the right decisions often become self-evident. It is impossible to make good decisions without infusing the entire process with an honest confrontation of the brutal facts. A primary task in taking a company from good to great is to create a culture wherein people have a tremendous opportunity to be heard, and ultimately, for the truth to be heard. Creating a climate where the truth is heard involves 4 basic practices. 1. Lead with questions, not answers. 2. Engage in dialogue and debate, not coercion. 3. Conduct autopsies without blame. 4. Build red flag mechanisms that turn information into information that cannot be ignored. The good to great companies faced just as much adversity as the comparison companies, but responded to that adversity differently. They hit the realities of their situation head on. As a result, they emerged from adversity even stronger. A key psychology for leading from good to great is the Stockdale paradox. Retain absolute faith that you can and will prevail in the end, regardless of the difficulties, and at the same time confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. Unexpected findings. Charisma can be as much a liability as an asset, as the strength of your leadership personality can deter people from bringing you the brutal facts. Leadership does not begin just with vision. It begins with getting people to confront the brutal facts and to act on the implications. Spending time and energy trying to motivate people is a waste of effort. The real question is not, how do we motivate our people? If you have the right people, they will be self-motivated. The key is to not demotivate them. One of the primary ways to demotivate people is to ignore the brutal facts of reality. Chapter 5: The Hedgehog Concept, Simplicity within the Three Circles. Know thyself. Scribes of Delphi, via Plato 1. Are you a hedgehog or a fox? In his famous essay, The Hedgehog and the Fox, Isaiah Berlin divided the world into hedgehogs and foxes, based upon an ancient Greek parable. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. 2. The fox is a cunning creature, able to devise a myriad of complex strategies for sneak attacks upon the hedgehog. Day in and day out, the fox circles around the hedgehog's den, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. Fast, sleek, beautiful, fleet of foot, and crafty, the fox looks like the sure winner. The hedgehog, on the other hand, is a dowdier creature, looking like a genetic mix-up between a porcupine and a small armadillo. He waddles along, going about his simple day, searching for lunch and taking care of his home. The fox waits in cunning silence at the juncture in the trail. The hedgehog, minding his own business, wanders right into the path of the fox. Aha, I've got you now, thinks the fox. He leaps out, bounding across the ground, lightning fast. The little hedgehog, sensing danger, looks up and thinks, here we go again. Will he ever learn? Rolling up into a perfect little ball, the hedgehog becomes a sphere of sharp spikes, pointing outward in all directions. The fox, bounding toward his prey, sees the hedgehog defense and calls off the attack. Retreating back to the forest, the fox begins to calculate a new line of attack. Each day, some version of this battle between the hedgehog and the fox takes place, and despite the greater cunning of the fox, the hedgehog always wins. Berlin extrapolated from this little parable to divide people into two basic groups, foxes and hedgehogs. Foxes pursue many ends at the same time and see the world in all its complexity. They are scattered or diffused, moving on many levels, says Berlin, never integrating their thinking into one overall concept or unifying vision. Hedgehogs, on the other hand, simplify a complex world into a single organizing idea, a basic principle or concept that unifies and guides everything. It doesn't matter how complex the world, a hedgehog reduces all challenges and dilemmas to simple, indeed almost simplistic, hedgehog ideas. For a hedgehog, anything that does not somehow relate to the hedgehog idea holds no relevance. Princeton professor Marvin Bressler pointed out the power of the hedgehog during one of our long conversations. You want to know what separates those who make the biggest impact from all the others who are just as smart. They are hedgehogs. Freud and the unconscious, Darwin and natural selection, Marx and class struggle, Einstein and relativity, Adam Smith and division of labor, they were all hedgehogs. They took a complex world and simplified it. Those who leave the biggest footprints, said Bressler, have thousands calling after them. Good idea, but you went too far. 3. To be clear, hedgehogs are not stupid. Quite the contrary. They understand that the essence of profound insight is simplicity. What could be more simple than E equals MC2? What could be simpler than the idea of the unconscious, organized into an ID, ego, and superego? What could be more elegant than Adam Smith's pin factory and invisible hand? No, the hedgehogs aren't simpletons. They have a piercing insight that allows them to see through complexity and discern underlying patterns. Hedgehogs see what is essential and ignore the rest. What does all this talk of hedgehogs and foxes have to do with good to great? Everything. Those who built the good to great companies were, to one degree or another, hedgehogs. They used their hedgehog nature to drive toward what we came to call a hedgehog concept for their companies. Those who led the comparison companies tended to be foxes, never gaining the clarifying advantage of a hedgehog concept, being instead scattered, diffused, and inconsistent. Consider the case of Walgreens versus Eckerd. Recall how Walgreens generated cumulative stock returns from the end of 1975 to 2000 that exceeded the market by over 15 times, handily beating such great companies as GE, Merck, Coca-Cola, and Intel. It was a remarkable performance for such an anonymous, some might even say boring, company. When interviewing Cork Walgreen, I kept asking him to go deeper, to help us understand these extraordinary results. Finally, in exasperation, he said, look, it just wasn't that complicated. Once we understood the concept, we just moved straight ahead. 4. What was the concept? Simply this, the best, most convenient drugstores, with high profit per customer visit. That's it. That's the breakthrough strategy that Walgreens used to beat Intel, GE, Coca-Cola, and Merck. In classic hedgehog style, Walgreens took the simple concept and implemented it with fanatical consistency. It embarked on a systematic program to replace all inconvenient locations with more convenient ones, preferably corner lots where customers could easily enter and exit from multiple directions. If a great corner location would open up just half a block away from a profitable Walgreens store in a good location, the company would close the good store even at a cost of $1 million to get out of the lease, to open a great new store on the corner. 5 Walgreens pioneered drive-through pharmacies, found customers liked the idea, and built hundreds of them. In urban areas, the company clustered its stores tightly together, on the precept that no one should have to walk more than a few blocks to reach a Walgreens. 6 in downtown San Francisco, for example, Walgreens clustered 9 stores within a 1-mile radius. 9 stores. 7 if you look closely, you will see Walgreens stores as densely packed in some cities as Starbucks coffee shops in Seattle. Walgreens then linked its convenience concept to a simple economic idea. Profit per customer visit. Tight clustering, 9 stores per mile, leads to local economies of scale, which provides the cash for more clustering, which in turn draws more customers. By adding high-margin services, like 1-hour photo developing, Walgreens increased its profit per customer visit. More convenience led to more customer visits, which, when multiplied times increased profit per customer visit, threw cash back into the system to build even more convenient stores. Store by store, block by block, city by city, region by region, Walgreens became more and more of a hedgehog with this incredibly simple idea. In a world overrun by management faddists, brilliant visionaries, ranting futurists, fearmongers, motivational gurus, and all the rest, it's refreshing to see a company succeed so brilliantly by taking one simple concept and just doing it with excellence and imagination. Becoming the best in the world at convenient drugstores, steadily increasing profit per customer visit. What could be more obvious and straightforward? Yet, if it was so obvious and straightforward, why didn't Eckerd see it? While Walgreens stuck only to cities where it could implement the convenience, a clustering concept, we found no evidence of a similarly coherent concept for growth at Eckerd. Dealmakers to the core, Eckerd's executives compulsively leapt at opportunities to acquire clumps of stores, 42 units. Here, 36 units there, in hodgepodge fashion, with no obvious unifying theme. While Walgreens executives understood that profitable growth would come by pruning away all that did not fit with the hedgehog concept, Eckerd executives lurched after growth for growth's sake. In the early 1980s, just as Walgreens became religious about carrying out its convenient drugstore concept, Eckerd threw itself into the home video market with its purchase of American Home Video Corporation. Eckerd's CEO told Forbes magazine in 1981, "Some feel the purer we are the better we'll be. But I want growth, and the home video industry is only emerging, unlike, say, drugstore chains." Eckerd's home video foray produced $31 million in losses before Eckerd sold it to Tandy, which crowed that it got the deal for $72 million below book value. 9. In the precise year of Eckerd's American Home Video acquisition, Walgreens and Eckerd had virtually identical revenues, $1.7 billion. 10 years later, Walgreens had grown to over twice the revenues of Eckerd, accumulating net profits $1 billion greater than Eckerd over the decade. 20 years later, Walgreens was going strong, as one of the most sustained transformations in our study. Meanwhile, Eckerd ceased to exist as an independent company. 10. The three circles. The notion of a hedgehog concept originated in our research team meetings, when we were trying to make sense of Walgreens' spectacular returns. Aren't we just talking about strategy? I asked. Convenient drugstores, profit per customer visit, isn't that just basic strategy? What's so interesting about that? But Eckerd also had strategy, said Jenny Cooper, who analyzed the contrast between the two companies. We can't say that it's just about having strategy. They both had strategy. Jenny was correct in her observation. Strategy per se did not distinguish the good to great companies from the comparison companies. Both sets of companies had strategic plans, and there's absolutely no evidence that the good to great companies invested more time and energy in strategy development and long-range planning. Okay, so are we just talking about good strategy versus bad strategy? The team sat there for a minute, thinking. Then Lee Wilbanks observed. But what I find so striking is their incredible simplicity. I mean, look at Kroger. With the superstore concept, or Kimberly-Clark with the move to paper-based consumer products, or Walgreens with convenient drugstores. These were simple ideas. The research team members all jumped into the fray, bantering about the companies they were studying. It soon became abundantly clear that all the good to great companies attained a very simple concept that they used as a frame of reference for all their decisions, and this understanding coincided with breakthrough results. Meanwhile, the comparison companies like Eckerd got all tripped up by their snazzy strategies for growth. Okay, I pushed back, but is simplicity enough? Just because it's simple doesn't mean it's right. The world is filled with failed companies that had simple but wrong ideas. Then we decided to undertake a systematic look at the concepts that guided the good to great companies in contrast to the comparison companies. After a few months of sifting and sorting, considering possibilities and tossing them out, we finally came to see that the hedgehog concept in each good to great company wasn't just any random simple idea. The essential strategic difference between the good to great and comparison companies lay in two fundamental distinctions. First, the good to great companies founded their strategies on deep understanding along three key dimensions, what we came to call the three circles. Second, the good to great companies translated that understanding into a simple, crystalline concept that guided all their efforts, hence the term hedgehog concept. More precisely, a hedgehog concept is a simple, crystalline concept that flows from deep understanding about the intersection of the following three circles. 1. What you can be the best in the world at, and equally important, what you cannot be the best in the world at. This discerning standard goes far beyond core competence. Just because you possess a core competence doesn't necessarily mean you can be the best in the world at it. Conversely, what you can be the best at might not even be something in which you are currently engaged. 2. What drives your economic engine? All the good to great companies attained piercing insight into how to most effectively generate sustained and robust cash flow and profitability. In particular, they discovered the single denominator, profit per X, that had the greatest impact on their economics. It would be cash flow per X in the social sector. 3. What you are deeply passionate about. The good to great companies focused on those activities that ignited their passion. The idea here is not to stimulate passion but to discover what makes you passionate. To quickly grasp the three circles, consider the following personal analogy. Suppose you were able to construct a work life that meets the following three tests. First, you are doing work for which you have a genetic or God-given talent, and perhaps you could become one of the best in the world in applying that talent. I feel that I was just born to be doing this. Second, you are well paid for what you do. I get paid to do this. Am I dreaming? Third, you are doing work you are passionate about and absolutely love to do, enjoying the actual process for its own sake. I look forward to getting up and throwing myself into my daily work, and I really believe in what I'm doing. If you could drive toward the intersection of these three circles and translate that intersection into a simple, crystalline concept that guided your life choices, then you'd have a hedgehog concept for yourself. To have a fully developed hedgehog concept, you need all three circles. If you make a lot of money doing things at which you could never be the best, you'll only build a successful company, not a great one. If you become the best at something, you'll never remain on top if you don't have intrinsic passion for what you are doing. Finally, you can be passionate all you want, but if you can't be the best at it, or it doesn't make economic sense, then you might have a lot of fun, but you won't produce great results. Understanding what you can and cannot be the best at. They stick with what they understand and let their abilities, not their egos, determine what they attempt. 11. So wrote Warren Buffett about his $290 million investment in Wells Fargo, despite his serious reservations about the banking industry. 12. Prior to clarifying its hedgehog concept, Wells Fargo had tried to be a global bank, operating like a mini Citicorp, and a mediocre one at that. Then, at first under Dick Cooley and then under Carl Reichert, Wells Fargo executives began to ask themselves a piercing set of questions. What can we potentially do better than any other company? And equally important, what can we not do better than any other company? And if we can't be the best at it, then why are we doing it at all? Putting aside their egos, the Wells Fargo team pulled the plug on the vast majority of its international operations, accepting the truth that it could not be better than Citicorp in global banking. 13. Wells Fargo then turned its attention to what it could be the best in the world at, running a bank like a business with a focus on the Western United States. That's it. That was the essence of the hedgehog concept that turned Wells Fargo from a mediocre Citicorp wannabe to one of the best performing banks in the world. Carl Reichert, CEO of Wells Fargo at the time of transition, stands as a consummate hedgehog. While his counterparts at Bank of America went into a reaction revolution panic mode in response to deregulation, hiring change gurus who used sophisticated models and time-consuming encounter groups, Reichert stripped everything down to its essential simplicity. 14. It's not space science stuff, he told us in our interview. What we did was so simple, and we kept it simple. It was so straightforward and obvious that it sounds almost ridiculous to talk about it. The average businessman coming from a highly competitive industry with no regulations would have jumped on this like a goose on a June bug. 15. Reichert kept people relentlessly focused on the simple hedgehog idea, continually reminding them that there's more money to be made in Modesto than Tokyo. 16. Those who worked with Reichert marveled at his genius for simplicity. If Carl were an Olympic diver, said one of his colleagues, he would not do a 5-flip twisting thing. He would do the best swan dive in the world, and do it perfectly over and over again. 17. The Wells Fargo focus on its hedgehog concept was so intense that it became, in its executives' own words, a mantra. Throughout our interviews, Wells Fargo people echoed the same basic theme: it wasn't that complicated. We just took a hard-nosed look at what we were doing and decided to focus entirely on those few things we knew we could do better than anyone else, not getting distracted into arenas that would feed our egos and at which we could not be the best. This brings me to one of the most crucial points of this chapter. A hedgehog concept is not a goal to be the best, a strategy to be the best, an intention to be the best, a plan to be the best. It is an understanding of what you can be the best at. The distinction is absolutely crucial. Every company would like to be the best at something, but few actually understand, with piercing insight and egoless clarity, what they actually have the potential to be the best at, and just as important, what they cannot be the best at. And it is this distinction that stands as one of the primary contrasts between the good to great companies and the comparison companies. Consider the contrast between Abbott Laboratories and Upjohn. In 1964, the two companies were almost identical in terms of revenues, profits, and product lines. Both companies had the bulk of their business in pharmaceuticals, principally antibiotics. Both companies had family management. Both companies lagged behind the rest of the pharmaceutical industry. But then, in 1974, Abbott had a breakthrough in performance, producing cumulative returns of 4.0 times the market and 5.5 times Upjohn over the next 15 years. One crucial difference between the two companies is that Abbott developed a hedgehog concept based on what it could be the best at and Upjohn did not. Abbott began by confronting the brutal facts. By 1964, Abbott had lost the opportunity to become the best pharmaceutical company. While Abbott had drowsily lumbered along in the 1940s and 1950s, living off its cash cow, erythromycin, companies like Merck had built research engines that rivaled Harvard and Berkeley. By 1964, George Kane and his Abbott team realized that Merck and others had such a huge research lead that trying to be the best pharmaceutical company would be like a high school football team trying to take on the Dallas Cowboys. Even though Abbott's entire history lay in pharmaceuticals, becoming the best pharmaceutical company was no longer a viable option. So, guided by Level 5 leader and tapping into the faith side of the Stockdale paradox, there must be a way for us to prevail as a great company, and we will find it. The Abbott team sought to understand what it could be the best at. Around 1967, a key insight emerged: we've lost the chance to be the best pharmaceutical company, but we have an opportunity to excel at creating products that contribute to cost-effective healthcare. Abbott had experimented with hospital nutritional products, designed to help patients quickly regain their strength after surgery, and diagnostic devices. One of the primary ways to reduce healthcare costs is through proper diagnosis. Abbott eventually became the #1 company in both of these arenas, which moved it far down the path of becoming the best company in the world at creating products that make healthcare more cost-effective. 18. Upjohn never confronted the same brutal reality, and continued to live with the delusion that it could beat Merck. 19 later, when it fell even further behind the pharmaceutical leaders, it diversified into arenas where it definitely could not be the best in the world, such as plastics and chemicals. As Upjohn fell even further behind, it returned to a focus on ethical drugs, yet never confronted the fact that it was just too small to win in the big-stakes pharmaceutical game. 20. Despite consistently spending nearly twice the percentage of sales on R&D as Abbott, Upjohn saw its profits dwindle to less than half those of Abbott before being acquired in 1995. 21. The Abbott versus Upjohn case highlights the difference between a core business and a hedgehog concept. Just because something is your core business, just because you've been doing it for years or perhaps even decades, does not necessarily mean that you can be the best in the world at it. And if you cannot be the best in the world at your core business, then your core business cannot form the basis of your hedgehog concept. Clearly, a hedgehog concept is not the same as a core competence. You can have competence at something, but not necessarily have the potential to be the best in the world at it. To use an analogy, consider the young person who gets straight A's in high school calculus and scores high on the math part of the SAT, demonstrating a core competence at mathematics. Does that mean the person should become a mathematician? Not necessarily. Suppose now that this young person goes off to college, enrolls in math courses, and continues to earn A's, yet encounters people who are genetically encoded for math. As one such student said after this experience, it would take me 3 hours to finish the final. Then there were those who finished the same final in 30 minutes and earned an A+. Their brains are just wired differently. I could be a very competent mathematician, but I soon realized I could never be one of the best. That young person might still get pressure from parents and friends to continue with math, saying, "But you're so good at it." Just like our young person, many people have been pulled or have fallen into careers where they can never attain complete mastery and fulfillment. Suffering from the curse of competence, but lacking a clear hedgehog concept, they rarely become great at what they do. The hedgehog concept requires a severe standard of excellence. It's not just about building on strength and competence, but about understanding what your organization truly has the potential to be the very best at and sticking to it. Like Upjohn, the comparison company stuck to businesses at which they were good, but could never be the best, or worse, launched off in pursuit of easy growth and profits in arenas where they had no hope of being the best. They made money, but never became great. To go from good to great requires transcending the curse of competence. It requires the discipline to say, just because we are good at it, just because we're making money and generating growth, doesn't necessarily mean we can become the best at it. The good to great companies understood that doing what you are good at will only make you good. Focusing solely on what you can potentially do better than any other organization is the only path to greatness. Every good to great company eventually gained deep understanding of this principle and pinned their futures on allocating resources to those few arenas where they could potentially be the best. See the table below. The comparison companies rarely attained this understanding. Insight into your economic engine. What is your denominator? The good to great companies frequently produce spectacular returns in very unspectacular industries. The banking industry ranked in the bottom quartile of industries in total returns during the same period that Wells Fargo beat the market by 4 times. Even more impressive, both Pitney Bowes and Nuka were in bottom 5% industries, yet both these companies beat the market by well over 5 times. Only one of the good to great companies had the benefit of being in a great industry, defined as a top 10% industry. 5 were in good industries, 5 were in bad to terrible industries. See Appendix 5.A for A. Summary of industry analysis. Our study clearly shows that a company does not need to be in a great industry to become a great company. Each good to great company built a fabulous economic engine, regardless of the industry. They were able to do this because they attained profound insights into their economics. This is not a book on microeconomics. Each company and each industry had its own economic realities, and I'm not going to bellabore them all here. The central point is that each good to great company attained a deep understanding of the key drivers in its economic engine and built its system in accordance with this understanding. That said, however, we did notice one particularly provocative form of economic insight that every good to great company attained, the notion of a single economic denominator. Think about it in terms of the following question. If you could pick one and only one ratio, profit per X, or, in the social sector, cash flow per X, to systematically increase over time, what X would have the greatest and most sustainable impact on your economic engine? We learned that this single question leads to profound insight into the inner workings of an organization's economics. Recall how Walgreens switched its focus from profit per store to profit per customer visit. Convenient locations are expensive, but by increasing profit per customer visit, Walgreens was able to increase convenience, 9 stores in a mile, and simultaneously increase profitability across its entire system. The standard metric of profit per store would have run contrary to the convenience concept. The quickest way to increase profit per store is to decrease the number of stores and put them in less expensive locations. This would have destroyed the convenience concept. Or consider Wells Fargo. When the Wells team confronted the brutal fact that deregulation would transform banking into a commodity, they realized that standard banker metrics, like profit per loan and profit per deposit, would no longer be the key drivers. Instead, they grasped a new denominator, profit per employee. Following this logic, Wells Fargo became one of the first banks to change its distribution system to rely primarily on stripped-down branches and ATMs. The denominator can be quite subtle, sometimes even unobvious. The key is to use the question of the denominator to gain understanding and insight into your economic model. For example, Fannie Mae grasped the subtle denominator of profit per mortgage risk level, not per mortgage, which would be the obvious choice. It's a brilliant insight. The real driver in Fannie Mae's economics is the ability to understand risk of default in a package of mortgages better than anyone else. Then it makes money selling insurance and managing the spread on that risk. Simple, insightful, unobvious, and right. Nuka, for example, made its mark in the ferociously price competitive steel industry with the denominator profit per ton of finished steel. At first glance, you might think that per employee or per fixed cost might be the proper denominator. But the Nuka people understood that the driving force in its economic engine was a combination of a strong work ethic culture and the application of advanced manufacturing technology. Profit per employee or per fixed cost would not capture this duality, as well as profit per ton of finished steel. Do you need to have a single denominator? No, but pushing for a single denominator tends to produce better insight than letting yourself off the hook with 3 or 4 denominators. The denominator question serves as a mechanism to force deeper understanding of the key drivers in your economic engine. As the denominator question emerged from the research, we tested the question on a number of executive teams. We found that the question always stimulated intense dialogue and debate. Furthermore, even in cases where the team failed or refused to identify a single denominator, the challenge of the question drove them to deeper insight. And that is, after all, the point, to have a denominator not for the sake of having a denominator, but for the sake of gaining insight that ultimately leads to more robust and sustainable economics. All the good to great companies discovered a key economic denominator, see the table on page 106, while the comparison companies usually did not. In fact, we found only one comparison case that attained a profound insight into its economics. Hasbro built its upswing on the insight that a portfolio of classic toys and games, such as G.I. Joe and Monopoly, produces more sustainable cash flow than big one-time hits. 23 In fact, Hasbro is the one comparison company that understood all 3 circles of the hedgehog concept. It became the best in the world at acquiring and renewing tried and true toys, reintroducing and recycling them at just the right time to increase profit per classic brand. And its people had great passion for the business. Systematically building from all 3 circles, Hasbro became the best performing comparison in our study, lending further credence to the power of the hedgehog concept. Hasbro became an unsustained transition in part because it lost the discipline to stay within the 3 circles after the unexpected death of CEO Stephen Hassenfeld. The Hasbro case reinforces a vital lesson. If you successfully apply these ideas, but then stop doing them, you will slide backward, from great to good, or worse. The only way to remain great is to keep applying the fundamental principles that made you great. Understanding your passion. When interviewing the Philip Morris executives, we encountered an intensity and passion that surprised us. Recall from Chapter 3 how George Weissman described working at the company as the great love affair of his life, second only to his marriage. Even with the most sinful collection of consumer products, Marlboro cigarettes, Miller beer, 67% fat-filled Velveeta, Maxwell House coffee for caffeine addicts, Toblerone for cocoholics, and so forth, we found tremendous passion for the business. Most of the top executives at Philip Morris were passionate consumers of their own products. In 1979, Ross Milheiser, then vice chairman of Philip Morris and a dedicated smoker, said, "I love cigarettes. It's one of the things that makes life really worth living." 24. The Philip Morris people clearly loved their company and had passion for what they were doing. It's as if they viewed themselves as the lone, fiercely independent cowboy depicted in the Marlboro billboards. "We have a right to smoke, and we will protect that right." A board member told me during my research for a previous project, "I really love being on the board of Philip Morris. It's like being part of something really special." She said this as she proudly puffed away. 25. Now, you might say, but that is just the defensiveness of the tobacco industry. Of course they'd feel that way. Otherwise, how could they sleep at night? But keep in mind that R.J. Reynolds was also in the tobacco business and under siege from society. Yet, unlike Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds executives began to diversify away from tobacco into any arena where it could get growth, regardless of whether they had passion for those acquisitions or whether the company could be the best in the world at them. The Philip Morris people stuck much closer to the tobacco business, in large part because they loved that business. In contrast, the R.J. Reynolds people saw tobacco as just a way to make money. As vividly portrayed in the book Barbarians at the Gate, R.J. Reynolds executives eventually lost passion for anything except making themselves rich through a leveraged buyout. 26. It may seem odd to talk about something as soft and fuzzy as passion as an integral part of a strategic framework. But throughout the good to great companies, passion became a key part of the hedgehog concept. You can't manufacture passion or motivate people to feel passionate. You can only discover what ignites your passion and the passions of those around you. The good to great companies did not say, okay, folks, let's get passionate about what we do. Sensibly, they went the other way entirely. We should only do those things that we can get passionate about. Kimberly-Clark executives made the shift to paper-based consumer products in large part because they could get more passionate about them. As one executive put it, the traditional paper products are okay, but they just don't have the charisma of a diaper. 27. When Gillette executives made the choice to build sophisticated, relatively expensive shaving systems rather than fight a low-margin battle with disposables, they did so in large part because they just couldn't get excited about cheap disposable razors. Zion talks about shaving systems with the sort of technical gusto one expects from a Boeing or Hughes engineer, wrote one journalist about Gillette's CEO in 1996. 28 Gillette has always been at its best when it sticks to businesses that fit its hedgehog concept. People who aren't passionate about Gillette need not apply, wrote a Wall Street Journal reporter, who went on to describe how a top business school graduate wasn't hired because she didn't show enough passion for deodorant. 29. Perhaps you, too, can't get passionate about deodorant. Perhaps you might find it hard to imagine being passionate about pharmacies, grocery stores, tobacco, or postage meters. You might wonder about what type of person gets all jazzed up about making a bank as efficient as McDonald's, or who considers a diaper charismatic. In the end, it doesn't really matter. The point is that they felt passionate about what they were doing and the passion was deep and genuine. This doesn't mean, however, that you have to be passionate about the mechanics of the business per se, although you might be. The passion circle can be focused equally on what the company stands for. For example, the Fannie Mae people were not passionate about the mechanical process of packaging mortgages into market securities. But they were terrifically motivated by the whole idea of helping people of all classes, backgrounds, and races realize the American dream of owning their home. Linda Knight, who joined Fannie Mae in 1983, just as the company faced its darkest days, told us, this wasn't just any old company getting into trouble, this was a company at the core of making home ownership a reality for thousands of Americans. It's a role that is far more important than just making money, and that's why we felt such depth of commitment to preserve, protect, and enhance the company. 30 as another Fannie Mae executive summed up, I see us as a key mechanism for strengthening the whole social fabric of America. Whenever I drive through difficult neighborhoods that are coming back, because more families own their homes, I return to work re-energized. The triumph of understanding over bravado. On the research team, we frequently found ourselves talking about the difference between pre-hedgehog and post-hedgehog states. In the pre-hedgehog state, it's like groping through the fog. You're making progress on a long march, but you can't see all that well. At each juncture in the trail, you can only see a little bit ahead and must move at a deliberate, slow crawl. Then, with the hedgehog concept, you break into a clearing, the fog lifts, and you can see for miles. From then on, each juncture requires less deliberation, and you can shift from crawl to walk, and from walk to run. In the post-hedgehog state, miles of trail move swiftly beneath your feet, forks in the road fly past as you quickly make decisions that you could not have seen so clearly in the fog. What's so striking about the comparison companies is that, for all their change programs, frantic gesticulations, and charismatic leaders, they rarely emerged from the fog. They would try to run, making bad decisions at forks in the road, and then have to reverse course later. Or they would veer off the trail entirely, banging into trees and tumbling down ravines, but they were sure doing it with speed and panache. For the comparison companies, the exact same world that had become so simple and clear to the good to great companies remained complex and shrouded in mist. Why? For two reasons. First, the comparison companies never asked the right questions, the questions prompted by the three circles. Second, they set their goals and strategies more from bravado than from understanding. Nowhere is this more evident than in the comparison companies' mindless pursuit of growth. Over 2/3 of the comparison companies displayed an obsession with growth without the benefit of a hedgehog concept. 31 statements, such as we've been a growth at any price company, and betting that size equals success, pepper the materials on the comparison companies. In contrast, not one of the good to great companies focused obsessively on growth. Yet they created sustained, profitable growth far greater than the comparison companies that made growth their mantra. Consider the case of Great Western and Fannie Mae. Great Western is a mite unwieldy, wrote the Wall Street Transcript. It wants to grow every way it can. 32 The company found itself in finance, leasing, insurance, and manufactured houses, continually acquiring companies in an expansion binge. 33 Bigger. More. In 1985, Great Western CEO told a gathering of analysts, don't worry about what you call us, a bank, an S&L, or a zebra. 34. Quite a contrast to Fannie Mae, which had a simple, crystalline understanding that it could be the best capital markets player in anything related to mortgages, better even than Goldman Sachs or Salomon Brothers in opening up the full capital markets to the mortgage process. It built a powerful economic machine by reframing its business model on risk management rather than mortgage selling. And it drove the machine with great passion, the Fannie Mae people inspired by its vital role in democratizing home ownership. Until 1984, the stock charts tracked each other like mirror images. Then in 1984, 1 year after it clarified its hedgehog concept, Fannie Mae exploded upward, while Great Western kept lollygagging along until just before its acquisition in 1997. By focusing on its simple, elegant conception, and not just focusing on growth, Fannie Mae grew revenues nearly threefold from its transition year in 1984 through 1996. Great Western, for all of its gobbling of growth steroids, grew revenues and earnings only 25% over the same period, then lost its independence in 1997. The Fannie Mae versus Great Western case highlights an essential point: growth is not a hedgehog concept. Rather, if you have the right hedgehog concept and make decisions relentlessly consistent with it, you will create such momentum that your main problem will not be how to grow, but how not to grow too fast. The hedgehog concept is a turning point in the journey from good to great. In most cases, the transition date follows within a few years of the hedgehog concept. Furthermore, everything from here on out in the book hinges upon having the hedgehog concept. As will become abundantly clear in the following chapters, disciplined action, the third big chunk in the framework, after disciplined people and disciplined thought, only makes sense in the context of the hedgehog concept. Despite its vital importance, or rather, because of its vital importance, it would be a terrible mistake to thoughtlessly attempt to jump right to a hedgehog concept. You can't just go off-site for 2 days, pull out a bunch of flip charts, do breakout discussions, and come up with a deep understanding. Well, you can do that, but you probably won't get it right. It would be like Einstein saying, I think it's time to become a great scientist, so I'm going to go off to the Four Seasons this weekend, pull out the flip charts, and unlock the secrets of the universe. Insight just doesn't happen that way. It took Einstein 10 years of groping through the fog to get the theory of special relativity, and he was a bright guy. 35. Notes. 1. Shows cumulative value of $1 invested December 31, 1970 January 1, 1984. 2. Dividends reinvested. Notes. 1. Fannie Mae transition point occurred in 1984. 2. Cumulative value of $1 invested December 31, 1984 to January 1, 2000. 3. Dividends reinvested. It took about 4 years on average for the good to great companies to clarify their hedgehog concepts. Like scientific insight, a hedgehog concept simplifies a complex world and makes decisions much easier. But while it has crystalline clarity and elegant simplicity once you have it, getting the concept can be devilishly difficult and takes time. Recognize that getting a hedgehog concept is an inherently iterative process, not an event. The essence of the process is to get the right people engaged in vigorous dialogue and debate, infused with the brutal facts, and guided by questions formed by the 3 circles. Do we really understand what we can be the best in the world at, as distinct from what we can just be successful at? Do we really understand the drivers in our economic engine, including our economic denominator? Do we really understand what best ignites our passion? One particularly useful mechanism for moving the process along is a device that we came to call the council. The council consists of a group of the right people who participate in dialogue and debate guided by the 3 circles, iteratively and over time, about vital issues and decisions facing the organization. See characteristics of the council below. In response to the question, how should we go about getting our hedgehog concept? I would point to the diagram on page 114 and say, build the council, and use that as a model. Ask the right questions, engage in vigorous debate, make decisions, autopsy the results, and learn, all guided within the context of the 3 circles. Just keep going through that cycle of understanding. When asked, how do we accelerate the process of getting a hedgehog concept? I would respond, increase the number of times you go around that full cycle in a given period of time. If you go through this cycle enough times, guided resolutely by the 3 circles, you will eventually gain the depth of understanding required for a hedgehog concept. It will not happen overnight, but it will eventually happen. Characteristics of the council. 1. The council exists as a device to gain understanding about important issues facing the organization. 2. The council is assembled and used by the leading executive and usually consists of 5 to 12 people. 3. Each council member has the ability to argue and debate in search of understanding, not from the egoistic need to win a point or protect a parochial interest. 4. Each council member retains the respect of every other council member, without exception. 5. Council members come from a range of perspectives, but each member has deep knowledge about some aspect of the organization and/or the environment in which it operates. 6. The council includes key members of the management team, but is not limited to members of the management team, nor is every executive automatically a member. 7. The council is a standing body, not an ad hoc committee assembled for a specific project. 8. The council meets periodically, as much as once a week, or as infrequently as once per quarter. 9. The council does not seek consensus, recognizing that consensus decisions are often at odds with intelligent decisions. The responsibility for the final decision remains with the leading executive. 10. The council is an informal body, not listed on any formal organization chart, or in any formal documents. 11. The council can have a range of possible names, usually quite innocuous. In the good to great companies, they had benign names like Long Range Profit Improvement Committee, Corporate Products Committee, Strategic Thinking Group, and Executive Council. Does every organization have a hedgehog concept to discover? What if you wake up, look around with brutal honesty, and conclude, we're not the best at anything, and we never have been? Therein lies one of the most exciting aspects of the entire study. In the majority of cases, the good to great companies were not the best in the world at anything and showed no prospects of becoming so. Infused with the Stockdale paradox, there must be something we can become the best at, and we will find it. We must also confront the brutal facts of what we cannot be the best at, and we will not delude ourselves. Every good to great company, no matter how awful at the start of the process, prevailed in its search for a hedgehog concept. As you search for your own concept, keep in mind that when the good to great companies finally grasped their hedgehog concept, it had none of the tiresome, irritating blasts of mindless bravado typical of the comparison companies. Yep, we could be the best at that was stated as the recognition of a fact, no more startling than observing that the sky is blue or the grass is green. When you get your hedgehog concept right, it has the quiet ping of truth, like a single, clear, perfectly struck note hanging in the air in the hushed silence of a full auditorium at the end of a quiet movement of a Mozart piano concerto. There is no need to say much of anything, the quiet truth speaks for itself. I'm reminded of a personal experience in my own family that illustrates the vital difference between bravado and understanding. My wife, Joanne, began racing marathons and triathlons in the early 1980s. As she accumulated experience, track times, swim splits, race results, she began to feel the momentum of success. One day, she entered a race with many of the best women triathletes in the world, and, despite a weak swim where she came out of the water hundreds of places behind the top swimmers, and having to push a heavy, non-aerodynamic bike up a long hill, she managed to cross the finish line in the top 10. Then, a few weeks later, while sitting at breakfast, Joanne looked up from her morning newspaper and calmly, quietly said, I think I could win the Ironman. The Ironman, the World Championship of Triathlons, involves 2.4 miles of ocean swimming and 112 miles of cycling, capped off with a 26.2-mile marathon foot race on the hot, lava-baked Kona coast of Hawaii. Of course, I'd have to quit my job, turn down my offers to graduate school. She had been admitted to graduate business school at a number of the top schools, and commit to full-time training. But her words had no bravado in them, no hype, no agitation, no pleading. She didn't try to convince me. She simply observed what she had come to understand was a fact, a truth no more shocking than stating that the walls were painted white. She had the passion. She had the genetics. And if she won races, she'd have the economics. The goal to win the Ironman flowed from early understanding of her hedgehog concept. And so, she decided to go for it. She quit her job. She turned down graduate schools. She sold the mills. But she did keep me on her bus. And 3 years later, on a hot October day in 1985, she crossed the finish line at the Hawaii Ironman in first place, world champion. When Joanne set out to win the Ironman, she did not know if she would become the world's best triathlete. But she understood that she could, that it was in the realm of possibility, that she was not living in a delusion. And that distinction makes all the difference. It is a distinction that those who want to go from good to great must grasp, and one that those who fail to become great so often never do. Chapter summary. Hedgehog concept. Simplicity within the 3 circles. Key points. To go from good to great requires a deep understanding of 3 intersecting circles translated into a simple, crystalline concept, the hedgehog concept. The key is to understand what your organization can be the best in the world at, and equally important, what it cannot be the best at, not what it wants to be the best at. The hedgehog concept is not a goal, strategy, or intention, it is an understanding. If you cannot be the best in the world at your core business, then your core business cannot form the basis of your hedgehog concept. The best in the world understanding is a much more severe standard than a core competence. You might have a competence, but not necessarily have the capacity to be truly the best in the world at that competence. Conversely, there may be activities at which you could become the best in the world, but at which you have no current competence. To get insight into the drivers of your economic engine, search for the one denominator, profit per X, or, in the social sector, cash flow per X, that has the single greatest impact. Good to great companies set their goals and strategies based on understanding. Comparison companies set their goals and strategies based on bravado. Getting the hedgehog concept is an iterative process. The counsel can be a useful device. Unexpected findings. The good to great companies are more like hedgehogs, simple, dowdy creatures that know one big thing and stick to it. The comparison companies are more like foxes, crafty, cunning creatures that know many things yet lack consistency. It took 4 years on average for the good to great companies to get a hedgehog concept. Strategy per se did not separate the good to great companies from the comparison companies. Both sets had strategies, and there is no evidence that the good to great companies spent more time on strategic planning than the comparison companies. You absolutely do not need to be in a great industry to produce sustained great results. No matter how bad the industry, every good to great company figured out how to produce truly superior economic returns. Chapter 6. A culture of discipline. Freedom is only part of the story and half the truth. That is why I recommend that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplanted by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. Viktor E. Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning 1. In 1980, George Rathmann co-founded the biotechnology company Amgen. Over the next 20 years, Amgen grew from a struggling entrepreneurial enterprise into a $3.2 billion company with 6,400 employees, creating blood products to improve the lives of people suffering through chemotherapy and kidney dialysis. 2. Under Rathmann, Amgen became one of the few biotechnology companies that delivered consistent profitability and growth. It became so consistently profitable, in fact, that its stock price multiplied over 150 times from its public offering in June 1983 to January 2000. An investor who bought as little as $7,000 of Amgen stock would have realized a capital gain of over $1 million, 13 times better than the same investment in the general stock market. Few successful startups become great companies, in large part, because they respond to growth and success in the wrong way. Entrepreneurial success is fueled by creativity, imagination, bold moves into uncharted waters, and visionary zeal. As a company grows and becomes more complex, it begins to trip over its own success. Too many new people, too many new customers, too many new orders, too many new products. What was once great fun becomes an unwieldy ball of disorganized stuff. Lack of planning, lack of accounting, lack of systems, and lack of hiring constraints create friction. Problems surface with customers, with cash flow, with schedules. In response, someone, often a board member, says, "It's time to grow up. This place needs some professional management." The company begins to hire MBAs and seasoned executives from blue-chip companies. Processes, procedures, checklists, and all the rest begin to sprout up like weeds. What was once an egalitarian environment gets replaced with a hierarchy. Chains of command appear for the first time. Reporting relationships become clear, and an executive class with special perks begins to appear. We and they segmentations appear, just like in a real company. The professional managers finally reign in the mess. They create order out of chaos, but they also kill the entrepreneurial spirit. Members of the founding team begin to grumble, "This isn't fun anymore. I used to be able to just get things done. Now I have to fill out these stupid forms and follow these stupid rules. Worst of all, I have to spend a horrendous amount of time in useless meetings." The creative magic begins to wane as some of the most innovative people leave, disgusted by the burgeoning bureaucracy and hierarchy. The exciting startup transforms into just another company, with nothing special to recommend it. The cancer of mediocrity begins to grow in earnest. George Rathmann avoided this entrepreneurial death spiral. He understood that the purpose of bureaucracy is to compensate for incompetence and lack of discipline, a problem that largely goes away if you have the right people in the first place. Most companies build their bureaucratic rules to manage the small percentage of wrong people on the bus, which in turn drives away the right people on the bus, which then increases the percentage of wrong people on the bus, which increases the need for more bureaucracy to compensate for incompetence and lack of discipline, which then further drives the right people away, and so forth. Rathmann also understood an alternative exists: avoid bureaucracy and hierarchy, and instead create a culture of discipline. When you put these two complementary forces together, a culture of discipline with an ethic of entrepreneurship, you get a magical alchemy of superior performance and sustained results. Why start this chapter with a biotechnology entrepreneur rather than one of our good to great companies? Because Rathmann credits much of his entrepreneurial success to what he learned while working at Abbott Laboratories before founding Amgen. What I got from Abbott was the idea that when you set your objectives for the year, you record them in concrete. You can change your plans through the year, but you never change what you measure yourself against. You are rigorous at the end of the year, adhering exactly to what you said was going to happen. You don't get a chance to editorialize. You don't get a chance to adjust and finagle, and decide that you really didn't intend to do that anyway, and readjust your objectives to make yourself look better. You never just focus on what you've accomplished for the year, you focus on what you've accomplished relative to exactly what you said you were going to accomplish, no matter how tough the measure. That was a discipline learned at Abbott, and that we carried into Amgen. 3. Many of the Abbott disciplines trace back to 1968, when it hired a remarkable financial officer named Bernard H. Semler. Semler did not see his job as a traditional financial controller or accountant. Rather, he set out to invent mechanisms that would drive cultural change. He created a whole new framework of accounting that he called responsibility accounting, wherein every item of cost, income, and investment would be clearly identified with a single individual responsible for that item. For the idea, radical for the 1960s, was to create a system wherein every Abbott manager in every type of job was responsible for his or her return on investment, with the same rigor that an investor holds an entrepreneur responsible. There would be no hiding behind traditional accounting allocations, no slopping funds about to cover up ineffective management, no opportunities for finger pointing. 5. But the beauty of the Abbott system lay not just in its rigor, but in how it used rigor and discipline to enable creativity and entrepreneurship. Abbott developed a very disciplined organization, but not in a linear way of thinking, said George Rathman. It was exemplary at having both financial discipline and the divergent thinking of creative work. We used financial discipline as a way to provide resources for the really creative work. 6. Abbott reduced its administrative costs as a percentage of sales to the lowest in the industry by a significant margin, and at the same time became a new product innovation machine like 3M, deriving up to 65% of revenues from new products introduced in the previous 4 years. 7. This creative duality ran through every aspect of Abbott during the transition era, woven into the very fabric of the corporate culture. On the one hand, Abbott recruited entrepreneurial leaders and gave them freedom to determine the best path to achieving their objectives. On the other hand, individuals had to commit fully to the Abbott system and were held rigorously accountable for their objectives. They had freedom, but freedom within a framework. Abbott instilled the entrepreneur's zeal for opportunistic flexibility. We recognize that planning is priceless, but plans are useless, said one Abbott executive. 8. But Abbott also had the discipline to say no to opportunities that failed the 3 circles test. While encouraging wide-ranging innovation within its divisions, Abbott simultaneously maintained fanatical adherence to its hedgehog concept of contributing to cost-effective healthcare. Abbott Laboratories exemplifies a key finding of our study, a culture of discipline. By its nature, culture is a somewhat unwieldy topic to discuss, less prone to clean frameworks like the 3 circles. The main points of this chapter, however, boil down to one central idea: build a culture full of people who take disciplined action within the 3 circles, fanatically consistent with the hedgehog concept. More precisely, this means the following. 1. Build a culture around the idea of freedom and responsibility within a framework. 2. Fill that culture with self-disciplined people who are willing to go to extreme lengths to fulfill their responsibilities. They will rinse their cottage cheese. 3. Don't confuse a culture of discipline with a tyrannical disciplinarian. 4. Adhere with great consistency to the hedgehog concept, exercising an almost religious focus on the intersection of the 3 circles. Equally important, create a stop-doing list and systematically unplug anything extraneous. Freedom and responsibility within a framework. Picture an airline pilot. She settles into the cockpit, surrounded by dozens of complicated switches and sophisticated gauges, sitting atop a massive $84 million piece of machinery. As passengers thump and stuff their bags into overhead bins and flight attendants scurry about trying to get everyone settled in, she begins her pre-flight checklist. Step by methodical step, she systematically moves through every required item. Cleared for departure, she begins working with air traffic control, following precise instructions: which direction to take out of the gate, which way to taxi, which runway to use, which direction to take off. She doesn't throttle up and hurtle the jet into the air until she's cleared for takeoff. Once aloft, she communicates continually with flight control centers and stays within the tight boundaries of the commercial air traffic system. On approach, however, she hits a ferocious thunder and hail storm. Blasting winds, crossways and unpredictable, tilt the wings down to the left, then down to the right. Looking out the windows, passengers can't see the ground, only the thinning and thickening globs of grey clouds and the spatter of rain on the windows. The flight attendants announce, "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to remain seated for the remainder of the flight. Please put your seats in the upright and locked position and place all your carry-on baggage under the seat in front of you. We should be on the ground shortly. Not too shortly, I hope," think the less experienced travelers, unnerved by the roiling wind and momentary flashes of lightning. But the experienced travelers just go on reading magazines, chatting with seatmates, and preparing for their meetings on the ground. I've been through all this before, they think. She'll only land if it's safe. Sure enough, on final approach, wheels down as £250,000 of steel glides down at 130 miles per hour. Passengers suddenly hear the engines whine and feel themselves thrust back into their seats. The plane accelerates back into the sky. It banks around in a big arc back toward the airport. The pilot takes a moment to click on the intercom. "Sorry, folks. We're getting some bad crosswinds there. We're going to give it another try. On the next go, the winds calm just enough and she brings the plane down, safely. Now take a step back and think about the model here. The pilot operates within a very strict system, and she does not have freedom to go outside of that system. You don't want airline pilots saying, "Hey, I just read in a management book about the value of being empowered, freedom to experiment, to be creative, to be entrepreneurial, to try a lot of stuff and keep what works." Yet at the same time, the crucial decisions, whether to take off, whether to land, whether to abort, whether to land elsewhere, rest with the pilot. Regardless of the strictures of the system, one central fact stands out above all others: the pilot has ultimate responsibility for the airplane and the lives of the people on it. The point here is not that a company should have a system as strict and inflexible as the air traffic system. After all, if a corporate system fails, people don't die by the hundreds in burning, twisted hunks of steel. Customer service at the airlines might be terrible, but you are almost certain to get where you are going in one piece. The point of this analogy is that when we looked inside the good to great companies, we were reminded of the best part of the airline pilot model: freedom and responsibility within the framework of a highly developed system. The good to great companies built a consistent system with clear constraints, but they also gave people freedom and responsibility within the framework of that system. They hired self-disciplined people who didn't need to be managed, and then managed the system, not the people. This was the secret to how we were able to run stores from a great distance, by remote control, said Bill Reavers of Circuit City. It was the combination of great store managers, who had ultimate responsibility for their individual stores, operating within a great system. You've got to have management and people who believe in the system, and who do whatever is necessary to make the system work. But within the boundaries of that system, store managers had a lot of leeway to coincide with their responsibility. 9. In a sense, Circuit City became to consumer electronics retailing what McDonald's became to restaurants, not the most exquisite experience, but an enormously consistent one. The system evolved over time as Circuit City experimented by adding new items like computers and video players, just like McDonald's added breakfast egg McMuffins. But at any given moment, everyone operated within the framework of the system. That's one of the major differences between us and all the others who were in the same business in the early 1980s, said Bill Zierden. They just couldn't roll it out further, and we could. We could stamp these stores out all over the country, with great consistency. 10. Therein lies one of the key reasons why Circuit City took off in the early 1980s, and beat the general stock market by more than 18 times over the next 15 years. In a sense, much of this book is about creating a culture of discipline. It all starts with disciplined people. The transition begins not by trying to discipline the wrong people into the right behaviors, but by getting self-disciplined people on the bus in the first place. Next we have disciplined thought. You need the discipline to confront the brutal facts of reality, while retaining resolute faith that you can and will create a path to greatness. Most importantly, you need the discipline to persist in the search for understanding until you get your hedgehog. Concept. Finally, we have disciplined action, the primary subject of this chapter. This order is important. The comparison companies often tried to jump right to disciplined action. But disciplined action without self-disciplined people is impossible to sustain, and disciplined action without disciplined thought is a recipe for disaster. Indeed, discipline by itself will not produce great results. We find plenty of organizations in history that had tremendous discipline and that marched right into disaster with precision and in nicely formed lines. No, the point is to first get self-disciplined people who engage in very rigorous thinking, who then take disciplined action within the framework of a consistent system designed around the hedgehog concept. Throughout our research, we were struck by the continual use of words like disciplined, rigorous, dogged, determined, diligent, precise, fastidious, systematic, methodical, workmanlike, demanding, consistent, focused, accountable, and responsible. They peppered articles, interviews, and source materials on the good to great companies, and were strikingly absent from the materials on the direct comparison companies. People in the good to great companies became somewhat extreme in the fulfillment of their responsibilities, bordering in some cases on fanaticism. We came to call this the rinsing your cottage cheese factor. The analogy comes from a disciplined world-class athlete named Dave Scott, who won the Hawaii Ironman triathlon 6 times. In training, Scott would ride his bike 75 miles, swim 20,000 meters, and run 17 miles, on average, every single day. Dave Scott did not have a weight problem. Yet he believed that a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet would give him an extra edge. So, Dave Scott, a man who burned at least 5,000 calories a day in training, would literally rinse his cottage cheese to get the extra fat off. Now, there is no evidence that he absolutely needed to rinse his cottage cheese to win the Ironman. That's not the point of the story. The point is that rinsing his cottage cheese was simply one more small step that he believed would make him just that much better, one more small step added to all the other small steps to create a consistent program of super discipline. I've always pictured Dave Scott running the 26 miles of the marathon, hammering away in 100-degree heat on the black, baked lava fields of the Kona coast after swimming 2.4 miles in the ocean and cycling 112 miles against ferocious crosswinds, and thinking to himself, compared to rinsing my cottage cheese every day, this just isn't that bad. I realize that it's a bizarre analogy. But in a sense, the good to great companies became like Dave Scott. Much of the answer to the question of good to great lies in the discipline to do whatever it takes to become the best within carefully selected arenas, and then to seek continual improvement from there. It's really just that simple. And it's really just that difficult. Everyone would like to be the best, but most organizations lack the discipline to figure out with egoless clarity what they can be the best at and the will to do whatever it takes to turn that potential into reality. They lack the discipline to rinse their cottage cheese. Consider Wells Fargo in contrast to Bank of America. Carl Reichert never doubted that Wells Fargo could emerge from bank deregulation as a stronger company, not a weaker one. He saw that the key to becoming a great company rested not with brilliant new strategies, but with the sheer determination to rip 100 years of banker mentality out of the system. There's too much waste in banking, said Reichert. Getting rid of it takes tenacity, not brilliance. 11. Reichert set a clear tone at the top. We're not going to ask everyone else to suffer while we sit on high. We will start by rinsing our own cottage cheese, right here in the executive suite. He froze executive salaries for 2 years, despite the fact that Wells Fargo was enjoying some of the most profitable years in its history. 12. He shut the executive dining room and replaced it with a college dorm food service caterer. 13. He closed the executive elevator, sold the corporate jets, and banned green plants from the executive suite as too expensive to water. 14. He removed free coffee from the executive suite. He eliminated Christmas trees for management. 15. He threw reports back at people who'd submitted them in fancy binders, with the admonishment, would you spend your own money this way? What does a binder add to anything? 16. Reichert would sit through meetings with fellow executives, in a beat-up old chair with the stuffing hanging out. Sometimes he would just sit there and pick at the stuffing while listening to proposals to spend money, said one article, and a lot of must-do projects just melted away. 17. Across the street at Bank of America, executives also faced deregulation and recognized the need to eliminate waste. However, unlike Wells Fargo, B of A executives didn't have the discipline to rinse their own cottage cheese. They preserved their posh executive kingdom in its imposing tower in downtown San Francisco, the CEO's office described in the book Breaking the Bank as a northeast corner suite with a large attached conference room, oriental rugs, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping panorama of the San Francisco Bay from the Golden Gate to the Bay Bridge. 18. We found no evidence of executive chairs with the stuffing hanging out. The elevator made its last stop at the executive floor and descended all the way to the ground in one quiet whoosh, unfettered by the intrusions of lesser beings. The vast open space in the executive suite made the windows look even taller than they actually were, creating a sense of floating above the fog in an elevated city of alien elites who ruled the world from above. 19. Why rinse our cottage cheese when life is so good? After losing $1.8 billion across 3 years in the mid-1980s, B of A eventually made the necessary changes in response to deregulation, largely by hiring ex-Wells executives. 20. But even in the darkest days, B of A could not bring itself to get rid of the perks that shielded its executives from the real world. At one board meeting during Bank of America's crisis period, one member made sensible suggestions like sell the corporate jet. Other directors listened to the recommendations, then passed them by. 21. A culture, not a tyrant. We almost didn't include this chapter in the book. On the one hand, the good to great companies became more disciplined than the direct comparison companies, as with Wells Fargo, in contrast to Bank of America. On the other hand, the unsustained comparisons showed themselves to be just as disciplined as the good to great companies. Based on my analysis, I don't think we can put discipline in the book as a finding, said Eric Hagan, after he completed a special analysis unit looking at the leadership cultures across the companies. It is absolutely clear that the unsustained comparison CEOs brought tremendous discipline to their companies, and that is why they got such great initial results. So, discipline just doesn't pass muster as a distinguishing variable. Curious, we decided to look further into the issue, and Eric undertook a more in-depth analysis. As we further examined the evidence, it became clear that, despite surface appearances, there was indeed a huge difference between the two sets of companies in their approach to discipline. Whereas the good to great companies had level 5 leaders who built an enduring culture of discipline, the unsustained comparisons had level 4 leaders who personally disciplined the organization through sheer force. Consider Ray McDonald, who took command of Burroughs in 1964. A brilliant but abrasive man, McDonald controlled the conversations, told all the jokes, and criticized those not as smart as he, which was pretty much everyone around him. He got things done through sheer force of personality, using a form of pressure that came to be known as the McDonald vice. 22. McDonald produced remarkable results during his reign. Every dollar invested in 1964, the year he became president, and taken out at the end of 1977, when he retired, produced returns 6.6 times better than the general market. 23 However, the company had no culture of discipline to endure beyond him. After he retired, his helper minions were frozen by indecision, leaving the company, according to Businessweek, with an inability to do anything. 24 Burroughs then began a long slide, with cumulative returns falling 93% below the market from the end of the McDonald era to 2000. We found a similar story at Rubbermaid under Stanley Galt. Recall from the Level 5 chapter that Galt quipped in response to the accusation of being a tyrant, "Yes, but I'm a sincere tyrant." Galt brought strict disciplines to Rubbermaid, rigorous planning and competitor analysis, systematic market research, profit analysis, hard-nosed cost control, and so on. "This is an incredibly disciplined organization," wrote one analyst. "There is an incredible thoroughness in Rubbermaid's approach to life." 25 Precise and methodical, Galt arrived at work by 6:30 and routinely worked 80-hour weeks, expecting his managers to do the same. 26. As chief disciplinarian, Galt personally acted as the company's #1 quality control mechanism. Walking down the street in Manhattan, he noticed a doorman muttering and swearing as he swept dirt into a Rubbermaid dustpan. Stan whirled around and starting grilling the man on why he was unhappy, said Richard Gates, who told the story to Fortune. Galt, convinced that the lip of the dustpan was too thick, promptly issued a dictate to his engineers to redesign the product. "On quality, I'm a son of Fabich," said Galt. His chief operating officer concurred. He gets livid. 27. Rubbermaid rose dramatically under the tyranny of the singularly disciplined leader, but then just as dramatically declined when he departed. Under Galt, Rubbermaid beat the market 3.6 to 1. After Galt, Rubbermaid lost 59% of its value relative to the market, before being bought out by Newell. One particularly fascinating example of the disciplinarian syndrome was Chrysler under Lee Iacocca, whom Businessweek described simply as the man. The dictator. Lee. 28 Iacocca became president of Chrysler in 1979 and imposed his towering personality to discipline the organization into shape. "Right away, I knew the place was in a state of anarchy, and it needed a dose of order and discipline, and quick," wrote Iacocca of his early days. 29 In his first year, he entirely overhauled the management structure, instituted strict financial controls, improved quality control measures, rationalized the production schedule, and conducted mass layoffs to preserve cash. 30 I felt like an army surgeon. We had to do radical surgery, saving what we could. 31 In dealing with the unions, he said, "If you don't help me out, I'm going to blow your brains out. I'll declare bankruptcy in the morning, and you'll all be out of work." 32 Iacocca produced spectacular results, and Chrysler became one of the most celebrated turnarounds in industrial history. About midway through his tenure, however, Iacocca seemed to lose focus and the company began to decline once again. The Wall Street Journal wrote, "Mr. Iacocca headed the Statue of Liberty renovation, joined a congressional commission on budget reduction, and wrote a second book. He began a syndicated newspaper column, bought an Italian villa where he started bottling his own wine and olive oil. Critics contend it all distracted him, and was a root cause of Chrysler's current problems. Distracting or not, it's clear that being a folk hero is a demanding sideline." 33. Worse than his moonlight career as a national hero, his lack of discipline to stay within the arenas in which Chrysler could be the best in the world led to a binge of highly undisciplined diversifications. In 1985, he was lured into the sexy aerospace business. Whereas most CEOs would be content with a single Gulfstream jet, Iacocca decided to buy the whole Gulfstream company. 34 Also in the mid-1980s, he embarked on a costly and ultimately unsuccessful joint venture with Italian sports car maker Maserati. Iacocca had a soft spot for Italians, said one retired Chrysler executive. Iacocca, who owns a modest estate in Tuscany, was so intent on an Italian alliance that commercial realities were ignored, suggest industry insiders, wrote Businessweek. 35 Some estimates put the loss of the failed Maserati venture at $200 million, which, according to Forbes, was an enormous sum to lose on a high-price, low-volume roadster. After all, no more than a few thousand will ever be built. 36. During the first half of his tenure, Iacocca produced remarkable results, taking the company from near bankruptcy to nearly 3 times the general market. During the second half of Iacocca's tenure, the company slid 31% behind the market and faced another potential bankruptcy. 37 Like so many patients with a heart condition, wrote a Chrysler executive, would survive surgery several years before only to revert to our unhealthy lifestyle. 38. The above cases illustrate a pattern we found in every unsustained comparison, a spectacular rise under a tyrannical disciplinarian, followed by an equally spectacular decline when the disciplinarian stepped away, leaving behind no enduring culture of discipline, or when the disciplinarian himself became undisciplined and strayed wantonly outside the 3 circles. Yes, discipline is essential for great results, but disciplined action without disciplined understanding of the 3 circles cannot produce sustained great results. Fanatical adherence to the hedgehog concept. For nearly 40 years, Pitney Bowes lived inside the warm and protective cocoon of a monopoly. With its close relationship to the U.S. Postal Service and its patents on postage meter machines, Pitney attained 100% of the metered mail market. 39 By the end of the 1950s, nearly half of all U.S. mail passed through Pitney Bowes machines. 40 With gross profit margins in excess of 80%, no competition, a huge market, and a recession-proof business, Pitney Bowes wasn't so much a great company as it was a company with a great monopoly. Then, as almost always happens to monopolies when the protective cocoon is ripped away, Pitney Bowes began a long slide. First came a consent decree that required Pitney Bowes to license its patents to competitors, royalty-free. 41. Within 6 years, Pitney Bowes had 16 competitors. 42 Pitney fell into a reactionary, Chicken Little of the sky is falling diversification frenzy, throwing cash after ill-fated acquisitions and joint ventures, including a $70 million bloodbath, 54% of net stockholders' equity at the time from a computer retail foray. In 1973, the company lost money for the first time in its history. It was shaping up to be just another typical case of a monopoly-protected company gradually falling apart once confronted with the harsh reality of competition. Fortunately, a level 5 leader named Fred Allen stepped in and asked hard questions that led to deeper understanding of Pitney's role in the world. Instead of viewing itself as a postage meter company, Pitney came to see that it could be the best in the world at servicing the back rooms of businesses within the broader concept of messaging. It also came to see that sophisticated back office products, like high-end faxes and specialized copiers, played right into its economic engine of profit per customer, building off its extensive sales and service network. Allen and his successor, George Harvey, instituted a model of disciplined diversification. For example, Pitney eventually attained 45% of the high-end fax market for large companies, a hugely profitable cash machine. 43 Harvey began a systematic process of investment in new technologies and products, such as the Paragon mail processor that seals and sends letters, and by the late 1980s, Pitney consistently derived over half its revenues from products introduced in the previous 3 years. 44 later, Pitney Bowes became a pioneer at linking backroom machines to the internet, yet another opportunity for disciplined diversification. The key point is that every step of diversification and innovation stayed within the three circles. After falling 77% behind the market from the consent decree to its darkest days in 1973, Pitney Bowes reversed course, eventually rising to over 11 times the market by the start of 1999. From 1973 to 2000, Pitney Bowes outperformed Coca-Cola, 3M, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, Motorola, Procter & Gamble, Hewlett-Packard, Walt Disney, and even General Electric. Can you think of any other company that emerged from the protective comfort of a monopoly cocoon to deliver this level of results? AT&T didn't. Xerox didn't. Even IBM didn't. Pitney Bowes illustrates what can happen when a company lacks the discipline to stay within the three circles, and conversely, what can happen when it regains that discipline. The good to great companies at their best followed a simple mantra: anything that does not fit with our hedgehog concept, we will not do. We will not launch unrelated businesses. We will not make unrelated acquisitions. We will not do unrelated joint ventures. If it doesn't fit, we don't do it. Period. In contrast, we found a lack of discipline to stay within the three circles as a key factor in the demise of nearly all the comparison companies. Every comparison either 1. Lacked the discipline to understand its three circles, or 2. Lacked the discipline to stay within the three circles. R.J. Reynolds is a classic case. Until the 1960s, R.J. Reynolds had a simple and clear concept, built around being the best tobacco company in the United States, a position it had held for at least 25 years. 45. Then in 1964, the Surgeon General's office issued its report that linked cigarettes with cancer, and R.J. Reynolds began to diversify away from tobacco as a defensive measure. Of course, all tobacco companies began to diversify at that time for the same reason, including Philip Morris. But R.J. Reynolds' wanderings outside its three circles defied all logic. R.J. Reynolds spent nearly a third of total corporate assets in 1970 to buy a shipping container company and an oil company, Sealand and Armin Oil, the idea being to make money by shipping its own oil. 46. Okay, not a terrible idea on its own. But what on earth did it have to do with R.J. Reynolds' hedgehog concept? It was a wholly undisciplined acquisition that came about in part because Sealand's founder was a close friend of R.J. Reynolds' chairman. 47. After pouring more than $2 billion into Sealand, the total investment nearly equaled the entire amount of net stockholders' equity. 48. Finally, after years of starving the tobacco business to funnel funds into the sinking ship business, RJR acknowledged failure and sold Sealand. 49. One Reynolds' grandson complained, "Look, these guys are the world's best at making and selling tobacco products, but what do they know about ships or oil? I'm not worried about them going broke, but they look like country boys with too much cash in their pockets." 50. To be fair, Philip Morris did not have a perfect diversification record either, as evidenced by its failed purchase of 7UP. However, in stark contrast to R.J. Reynolds, Philip Morris displayed greater discipline in response to the 1964 Surgeon General's report. Instead of abandoning its hedgehog concept, Philip Morris redefined its hedgehog concept in terms of building global brands in not-so-healthy consumables, tobacco, beer, soft drinks, coffee, chocolate, processed cheese, etc. Philip Morris' superior discipline to stay within the three circles is one key reason why the results of the two companies diverged so dramatically after the 1964 report, despite the fact that they both faced the exact same industry opportunities and threats. From 1964 to 1989, when R.J. Reynolds disappeared from public trading in a leveraged buyout, $1 invested in Philip Morris beat $1 invested in R.J. Reynolds by over 4 times. Few companies have the discipline to discover their hedgehog concept, much less the discipline to build consistently within it. They fail to grasp a simple paradox: the more an organization has the discipline to stay within its three circles, the more it will have attractive opportunities for growth. Indeed, a great company is much more likely to die of indigestion from too much opportunity than starvation from too little. The challenge becomes not opportunity creation, but opportunity selection. It takes discipline to say no, thank you, to big opportunities. The fact that something is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity is irrelevant if it doesn't fit within the three circles. This notion of fanatical consistency relative to the hedgehog concept doesn't just concern the portfolio of strategic activities. It can relate to the entire way you manage and build an organization. Nuka built its success around the hedgehog concept of harnessing culture and technology to produce deal. Central to the Nuka concept was the idea of aligning worker interests with management and shareholder interests through an egalitarian meritocracy largely devoid of class distinctions. Wrote Ken Iverson in his 1998 book Plain Talk. Inequality still runs rampant in most business corporations. I'm referring now to hierarchical inequality, which legitimizes and institutionalizes the principle of we versus they. The people at the top of the corporate hierarchy grant themselves privilege after privilege, flaunt those privileges before the men and women who do the real work, then wonder why employees are unmoved by management's invocations to cut costs and boost profitability. When I think of the millions of dollars spent by people at the top of the management hierarchy on efforts to motivate people who are continually put down by that hierarchy, I can only shake my head in wonder. 51. When we interviewed Ken Iverson, he told us that nearly 100% of the success of Nuka was due to its ability to translate its simple concept into disciplined action consistent with that concept. It grew into a $3.5 billion Fortune 500 company with only 4 layers of management and a corporate headquarters staff of fewer than 25 people, executive, financial, secretarial, the whole shebang, crammed into a rented office the size of a small dental practice. 52. Cheap veneer furniture adorned the lobby, which itself was not much larger than a closet. Instead of a corporate dining room, executives hosted visiting dignitaries at Phil's Diner, a strip mall sandwich shop across the street. 53. Executives did not receive better benefits than frontline workers. In fact, executives had fewer perks. For example, all workers, but not executives, were eligible to receive $2,000 per year for each child for up to 4 years of post-high school education. 54. In one incident, a man came to Marvin Pullman and said, "I have 9 kids. Are you telling me that you'll pay for 4 years of school, college, trade school, whatever, for every single one of my kids?" Pullman acknowledged that, yes, that's exactly what would happen. The man just sat there and cried, said Pullman. I'll never forget it. It just captures in one moment so much of what we were trying to do. 55. When Nuka had a highly profitable year, everyone in the company would have a very profitable year. Nuka workers became so well paid that one woman told her husband, "If you get fired from Nuka, I'll divorce you." 56. But when Nuka faced difficult times, everyone from top to bottom suffered. But people at the top suffered more. In the 1982 recession, for example, worker pay went down 25%, officer pay went down 60%, and the CEO's pay went down 75%. 57. Nuka took extraordinary steps to keep at bay the class distinctions that eventually encroach on most organizations. All 7,000 employees' names appeared in the annual report, not just officers and executives. 58. Everyone except safety supervisors and visitors wore the same color hard hats. The color of hard hats might sound trivial, but it caused quite a stir. Some foremen complained that special colored hard hats identified them as higher in the chain, an important status symbol that they could put on the back shelves of their cars or trucks. Nuka responded by organizing a series of forums to address the point that your status and authority in Nuka come from your leadership capabilities, not your position. If you don't like it, if you really feel you need that class distinction, well, then, Nuka is just not the right place for you. 59. In contrast to Nuka's dental suite-sized headquarters, Bethlehem Steel built a 21-story office complex to house its executive staff. At extra expense, it designed the building more like a cross than a rectangle, a design that accommodated the large number of vice presidents who needed corner offices. The vice presidents had to have windows in two directions, so it was out of that desire that we came up with the design, explained a Bethlehem executive. 60. In his book Crisis in Bethlehem, John Stromeyer details a culture as far to the other end of the continuum from Nuka as you can imagine. He describes a fleet of corporate aircraft, used even for taking executives' children to college and flitting away to weekend hideaways. He describes a world-class 18-hole executive golf course, an executive country club renovated with Bethlehem corporate funds, and even how executive rank determined shall priority at the club. 61. We came to the conclusion that Bethlehem executives saw the very purpose of their activities as the perpetuation of a class system that elevated them to elite status. Bethlehem did not decline in the 1970s and 1980s primarily because of imports or technology. Bethlehem declined first and foremost because it was a culture wherein people focused their efforts on negotiating the nuances of an intricate social hierarchy, not on customers, competitors, or changes in the external world. From 1966, at the start of its build-up, to 1999, Nuka posted 34 consecutive years of positive profitability, while over those same 34 years, Bethlehem lost money 12 times and its cumulative profitability added up to less than zero. By the 1990s, Nuka's profitability beat Bethlehem's every single year, and at the end of the century, Nuka, which had been less than a third the size of Bethlehem only a decade earlier, finally surpassed Bethlehem. In total revenues. 62. Even more astounding, Nuka's average 5-year profit per employee exceeded Bethlehem by almost 10 times. 63. And for the investor, $1 invested in Nuka beat $1 invested in Bethlehem Steel by over 200 times. To be fair, Bethlehem had one giant problem not faced by Nuka: adversarial labor relations and entrenched unions. Nuka had no union and enjoyed remarkably good relations with its workers. In fact, when union organizers visited one plant, workers felt so ferociously loyal to Nuka that management had to protect the union organizers from workers who began shouting and throwing sand at them. 64. But the union argument begs a crucial question: why did Nuka have such a better relationship with its workers in the first place? Because Ken Iverson and his team had a simple, crystalline hedgehog concept about aligning worker interests with management interests, and, most importantly, because they were willing to go to almost extreme lengths to build the entire enterprise consistent with that concept. Call them a bit fanatical if you want, but to create great results requires a nearly fanatical dedication to the idea of consistency within the hedgehog concept. Start a stop doing list. Do you have a to-do list? Do you also have a stop doing list? Most of us lead busy but undisciplined lives. We have ever-expanding to-do lists, trying to build momentum by doing, and doing more. And it rarely works. Those who built the good to great companies, however, made as much use of stop doing lists as to-do lists. They displayed a remarkable discipline to unplug all sorts of extraneous junk. When Darwin Smith became CEO of Kimberly-Clark, he made great use of stop doing lists. He saw that playing the annual forecast game with Wall Street focused people too much on the short term, so he just stopped doing it. On balance, I see no net advantage to our stockholders when we annually forecast future earnings, said Smith. We will not do it. 65. He saw title creep as a sign of class consciousness and bureaucratic layering, so he simply unplugged titles. No one at the company would have a title, unless it was for a position where the outside world demanded a title. He saw increasing layers as the natural result of empire building. So he simply unplugged a huge stack of layers with a simple elegant mechanism. If you couldn't justify to your peers the need for at least 15 people reporting to you to fulfill your responsibilities, then you would have 0 people reporting to you. 66. Keep in mind that he did this in the 1970s, long before it became fashionable. To reinforce the idea that Kimberly-Clark should begin thinking of itself as a consumer company, not a paper company, he unplugged Kimberly from all paper industry trade associations. 67. The good to great companies institutionalized the discipline of stop doing through the use of a unique budget mechanism. Stop and think for a moment. What is the purpose of budgeting? Most answer that budgeting exists to decide how much to apportion to each activity, or to manage costs, or both. From a good to great perspective, both of these answers are wrong. In a good to great transformation, budgeting is a discipline to decide which arenas should be fully funded and which should not be funded at all. In other words, the budget process is not about figuring out how much each activity gets, but about determining which activities best support the hedgehog concept and should be fully strengthened and which should be eliminated entirely. Kimberly-Clark didn't just reallocate resources from the paper business to the consumer business. It completely eliminated the paper business, sold the mills, and invested all the money into the emerging consumer business. I had an interesting conversation with some executives from a company in the paper business. It's a good company, not yet a great one, and they had competed directly with Kimberly-Clark before Kimberly transformed itself into a consumer company. Out of curiosity, I asked them what they thought of Kimberly-Clark. What Kimberly did is not fair, they said. Not fair. I looked quizzical. Oh, sure, they'd become a much more successful company. But, you know, if we'd sold our paper business and become a powerful consumer company, we could have been great, too. But we just have too much invested in it, and we couldn't have brought ourselves to do it. If you look back on the good to great companies, they displayed remarkable courage to channel their resources into only one or a few arenas. Once they understood their 3 circles, they rarely hedged their bets. Recall Kroger's commitment to overturn its entire system to create superstores, while A&P clung to the safety of its older stores. Recall Abbott's commitment to put the bulk of its resources into becoming number 1 in diagnostics and hospital nutritionals, while Upjohn clung to its core pharmaceutical business, where it could never be the best in the world. Recall how Walgreens exited the profitable food service business and focused all its might into one idea: the best, most convenient drugstores. Recall Gillette and Sensor, Nuka and the Minimills, Kimberly-Clark, and selling the mills to channel all its resources into the consumer business. They all had the guts to make huge investments, once they understood the hedgehog concept. The most effective investment strategy is a highly undiversified portfolio when you are right. As facetious as that sounds, that's essentially the approach the good to great companies took. Being right means getting the hedgehog concept. Highly undiversified means investing fully in those things that fit squarely within the three circles and getting rid of everything else. Of course, the key here is the little caveat, when you are right. But how do you know when you're right? In studying the companies, we learned that being right just isn't that hard if you have all the pieces in place. If you have level 5 leaders who get the right people on the bus, if you confront the brutal facts of reality, if you create a climate where the truth is heard, if you have a council and work within the three circles, if you frame all decisions in the context of a crystalline hedgehog concept, if you act from understanding, not bravado, if you do all these things, then you are likely to be right on the big decisions. The real question is, once you know the right thing, do you have the discipline to do the right thing, and, equally important, to stop doing the wrong things? Chapter Summary: A Culture of Discipline. Key points. Sustained great results depend upon building a culture full of self-disciplined people who take disciplined action, fanatically consistent with the three circles. Bureaucratic cultures arise to compensate for incompetence and lack of discipline, which arise from having the wrong people on the bus in the first place. If you get the right people on the bus and the wrong people off, you don't need stultifying bureaucracy. A culture of discipline involves a duality. On the one hand, it requires people who adhere to a consistent system, yet, on the other hand, it gives people freedom and responsibility within the framework of that system. A culture of discipline is not just about action. It is about getting disciplined people who engage in disciplined thought and who then take disciplined action. The good to great companies appear boring and pedestrian looking in from the outside, but upon close inspection, they are full of people who display extreme diligence and a stunning intensity. They rinse their cottage cheese. Do not confuse a culture of discipline with a tyrant who disciplines. They are very different concepts, one highly functional, the other highly dysfunctional. Savior CEOs who personally discipline through sheer force of personality usually fail to produce sustained results. The single most important form of discipline for sustained results is fanatical adherence to the hedgehog concept and the willingness to shun opportunities that fall outside the three circles. Unexpected findings. The more an organization has the discipline to stay within its three circles with almost religious consistency, the more it will have opportunities for growth. The fact that something is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity is irrelevant unless it fits within the three circles. A great company will have many once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. The purpose of budgeting in a good to great company is not to decide how much each activity gets, but to decide which arenas best fit with the hedgehog concept and should be fully funded and which should not be funded at all. Stop doing lists are more important than to-do lists. Chapter 7: Technology Accelerators. Most men would rather die than think. Many do. Bertrand Russell 1. On July 28, 1999, Drugstore.com, one of the first internet pharmacies, sold shares of its stock to the public. Within seconds of the opening bell, the stock multiplied nearly threefold to $65 per share. 4 weeks later, the stock closed as high as $69, creating a market valuation of over $3.5 billion. Not bad for an enterprise that had sold products for less than 9 months, had fewer than 500 employees, offered no hope of investor dividends for years, if not decades, and deliberately planned to lose hundreds of millions of dollars before turning a single dollar profit. What rationale did people use to justify these rather extraordinary numbers? New technology will change everything, the logic went. The internet is going to completely revolutionize all businesses, the gurus chanted. It's the great internet land grab, be there first, be there fast, build market share, no matter how expensive, and you win, yelled the entrepreneurs. We entered a remarkable moment in history, when the whole idea of trying to build a great company seemed quaint and outdated. Built to flip became the mantra of the day. Just tell people you were doing something, anything, connected to the internet, and presto, you became rich by flipping shares to the public, even if you had no profits, or even a real company. Why take all the hard steps to go from build up to breakthrough, creating a model that actually works, when you could yell, new technology, or new economy, and convince people to give you hundreds of millions of dollars? Some entrepreneurs didn't even bother to suggest that they would build a real company at all, much less a great one. One even filed to go public in March of 2000 with an enterprise that consisted solely of an informational website and a business plan, nothing more. The entrepreneur admitted to the industry standard that it seemed strange to go public before starting a business, but that didn't stop him from trying to persuade investors to buy 1.1 million shares at $7 to $9 per share, despite having no revenues, no employees, no customers, no company. 3 with the new technology of the internet, who needs all those archaic relics of the old economy? Also the logic went. At the high point of this frenzy, Drugstore.com issued its challenge to Walgreens. At first, Walgreens stock suffered from the invasion of the dot-coms, losing over 40% of its price in the months leading up to the Drugstore.com public offering. Wrote Forbes in October 1999, investors seem to think that the web race will be won by competitors who hit the ground running, companies like Drugstore.com, which trades at 398 times revenue, rather than Walgreens, trading at 1.4 times revenue. 4 analysts downgraded Walgreens stock, and the pressure on Walgreens to react to the internet threat increased as nearly $15 billion in market value evaporated. 5. Walgreens' response in the midst of this frenzy. We're a crawl, walk, run company, Dan Jaunt told Forbes in describing his deliberate, methodical approach to the internet. Instead of reacting like Chicken Little, Walgreens executives did something quite unusual for the times. They decided to pause and reflect. They decided to use their brains. They decided to think. Slow at first to crawl, Walgreens began experimenting with a website while engaging in intense internal dialogue and debate about its implications within the context of its own peculiar hedgehog concept. How will the internet connect to our convenience concept? How can we tie it to our economic denominator of cash flow per customer visit? How can we use the web to enhance what we do better than any other company in the world and in a way that we are passionate about? Throughout, Walgreens executives embrace the Stockdale paradox. We have complete faith that we can prevail in an internet world as a great company, yet we must also confront the brutal facts of reality about the internet. One Walgreens executive told us a fun little story about this remarkable moment in history. An internet leader made a statement about Walgreens along the lines of, "Oh, Walgreens. They're too old and stodgy for the internet world. They'll be left behind." The Walgreens people, while irked by this arrogant comment from the internet elite, never seriously considered a public response. Said one executive, "Let's quietly go about doing what we need to do, and it'll become clear soon enough that they just pulled the tail of the wrong dog." Then a little faster, walk, Walgreens began to find ways to tie the internet directly to its sophisticated inventory and distribution model and, ultimately, its convenience concept. Fill your prescription online, pop into your car, and go to your local Walgreens drive-thru in whatever city you happen to be in at the moment. Zoom past the window with hardly a moment's pause picking up your bottle of whatever. Or have it shipped to you, if that's more convenient. There was no manic lurching about, no hype, no bravado, just calm, deliberate pursuit of understanding, followed by calm, deliberate steps forward. Then, finally, run, Walgreens bet big, launching an internet site as sophisticated and well-designed as most pure.coms. Just before writing this chapter, in October 2000, we went online to use Walgreens.com. We found it as easy to use and the system of delivery as reliable and well thought out as Amazon.com, the reigning champion of e-commerce at the time. Precisely 1 year after the Forbes article, Walgreens had figured out how to harness the internet to accelerate momentum, making it just that much more unstoppable. It announced, on its website, a significant increase in job openings to support its sustained growth. From its low point in 1999 at the depths of the dot-com scare, Walgreens' stock price nearly doubled within a year. And what of Drugstore.com? Continuing to accumulate massive losses, it announced a layoff to conserve cash. At its high point, little more than a year earlier, Drugstore.com traded at a price 26 times higher than at the time of this writing. It had lost nearly all of its initial value. 6 While Walgreens went from crawl to walk to run, Drugstore.com went from run to walk to crawl. Perhaps Drugstore.com will figure out a sustainable model that works and become a great company. But it will not become great because of snazzy technology, hype, and an irrational stock market. It will only become a great company if it figures out how to apply technology to a coherent concept that reflects understanding of the 3 circles. Technology and the hedgehog concept. Now, you might be thinking, but the internet frenzy is just a speculative bubble that burst. So what? Everybody knew that the bubble was unsustainable, that it just couldn't last. What does that teach us about good to great? To be clear, the point of this chapter has little to do with the specifics of the internet bubble, for so bubbles come and bubbles go. It happened with the railroads. It happened with electricity. It happened with radio. It happened with the personal computer. It happened with the internet. And it will happen again with unforeseen new technologies. Yet through all of this change, great companies have adapted and endured. Indeed, most of the truly great companies of the last 100 years, from Walmart to Walgreens, from Procter & Gamble to Kimberly-Clark, from Merck to Abbott, trace their roots back through multiple generations of technology change, be it electricity, the television, or the internet. They've adapted before and emerged great. The best ones will adapt again. Technology-induced change is nothing new. The real question is not, what is the role of technology? Rather, the real question is, how do good to great organizations think differently about technology? We could have predicted that Walgreens would eventually figure out the internet. The company had a history of making huge investments in technology long before other companies in its industry became tech-savvy. In the early 1980s, it pioneered a massive network system called Intercom. The idea was simple. By linking all Walgreens stores electronically and sending customer data to a central source, it turned every Walgreens outlet in the country into a customer's local pharmacy. You live in Florida, but you're visiting Phoenix and need a prescription refill. No problem, the Phoenix store is linked to the central system, and it's just like going down to your hometown Walgreens store. This might seem mundane by today's standards. But when Walgreens made the investment in Intercom in the late 1970s, no one else in the industry had anything like it. Eventually, Walgreens invested over $400 million in Intercom, including $100 million for its own satellite system. 7 Touring the Intercom headquarters, dubbed Earth Station Walgreen, is like taking a trip through a NASA Space Center with its stunning array of sophisticated electronic gadgetry, wrote a trade journal. 8 Walgreens technical staff became skilled at maintaining every piece of technology, rather than relying on outside specialists. 9 It didn't stop there. Walgreens pioneered the application of scanners, robotics, computerized inventory control, and advanced warehouse tracking systems. The internet is just one more step in a continuous pattern. Walgreens didn't adopt all of this advanced technology just for the sake of advanced technology, or in fearful reaction to falling behind. No, it used technology as a tool to accelerate momentum after hitting breakthrough, and tied technology directly to its hedgehog concept of convenient drugstores increasing profit per customer visit. As an interesting aside, as technology became increasingly sophisticated in the late 1990s, Walgreens' CIO, Chief Information Officer, was a registered pharmacist by training, not a technology guru. 10 Walgreens remained resolutely clear. Its hedgehog concept would drive its use of technology, not the other way around. The Walgreens case reflects a general pattern. In every good to great case, we found technological sophistication. However, it was never technology per se, but the pioneering application of carefully selected technologies. Every good to great company became a pioneer in the application of technology, but the technologies themselves varied greatly. See the table on page 150. Kroger, for example, was an early pioneer in the application of barcode scanners, which helped it accelerate past A&P by linking frontline purchases to backroom inventory management. This might not sound very exciting. Inventory management is not something that tends to rivet readers, but think of it this way. Imagine walking back into the warehouse, and instead of seeing boxes of cereal and crates of apples, you see stacks and stacks of dollar bills, hundreds of thousands and millions of freshly minted, crisp and crinkly dollar bills just sitting there on pallets, piled high to the ceiling. That's exactly how you should think of inventory. Every single case of canned carrots is not just a case of canned carrots, it's cash. And it's cash just sitting there useless, until you sell that case of canned carrots. Now recall how Kroger systematically shed its dreary old and small grocery stores, replacing them with nice, big, shiny superstores. To accomplish this task ultimately required more than $9 billion of investment, cash that would somehow have to be pulled out of the low-margin grocery business. To put this in perspective, Kroger put more than twice its total annual profits into capital expenditures on average every year for 30 years. 11 Even more impressive, despite taking on $5.5 billion of junk bond debt to pay a one-time $40 per share cash dividend plus an $8 junior debenture to fight off corporate raiders in 1988, Kroger continued its cash-intensive revamping throughout the 1980s and 1990s. 12 Kroger modernized and turned over all its stores, improved the customer's shopping experience, radically expanded the variety of products offered, and paid off billions of dollars of debt. Kroger's use of scanning technology to take hundreds of millions of crisp and crinkly dollar bills out of the warehouse and put them to better use became a key element in its ability to pull off its magic trick, pulling not 1, not 2, but 3 rabbits out of a hat. Gillette also became a pioneer in the application of technology. But Gillette's technology accelerators lay largely in manufacturing technology. Think about The technology required to make billions, literally billions, of low-cost, high-tolerance razor blades. When you and I pick up a Gillette razor, we expect the blade to be perfect, and we expect it to be inexpensive for shave. For example, to create the sensor, Gillette invested over $200 million in design and development, most of it focused on manufacturing breakthroughs, and earned 29 patents. 13. It pioneered the application of laser welding on a mass scale to shaving systems, a technology normally used for expensive and sophisticated products like heart pacemakers. 14. The whole key to Gillette's shaving systems lay in manufacturing technology so unique and proprietary that Gillette protected it the way Coca-Cola protects its secret formula, complete with armed guards and security clearances. 15. Technology as an accelerator, not a creator of momentum. When Jim Johnson became CEO of Fannie Mae, following David Maxwell, he and his leadership team hired a consulting firm to conduct a technology audit. The lead consultant, Bill Kelvey, used a 4-level ranking, with 4 being cutting edge and 1 being stone age. Fannie Mae ranked only a 2. So, following the principle of first who, Kelvey was hired to move the company ahead. 16. When Kelvey came to Fannie Mae in 1990, the company lagged about 10 years behind Wall Street in the use of technology. Over the next 5 years, Kelvey systematically took Fannie Mae from a 2 to a 3.8 on the 4-point ranking. 17. He and his team created over 300 computer applications, including sophisticated analytical programs to control the $600 billion mortgage portfolio, online data warehouses covering 60 million properties, and streamlined workflows, significantly reducing paper and clerical effort. We moved technology out of the back office and harnessed it to transform every part of the business, said Kelvey. We created an expert system that lowers the cost of becoming a homeowner. Lenders using our technology reduced the loan approval time from 30 days to 30 minutes and lowered the associated costs by over $1,000 per loan. To date, the system has saved home buyers nearly $4 billion. 18. Notice that the Fannie Mae transition began in 1981 with the arrival of David Maxwell, yet the company lagged behind in the application of technology until the early 1990s. Yes, technology became of prime importance to Fannie Mae, but after it discovered its hedgehog concept and after it reached breakthrough. Technology was a key part of what Fannie Mae leaders called the second wind of the transformation and acted as an accelerating factor. 19. The same pattern holds for Kroger, Gillette, Walgreens, and all the good to great companies. The pioneering application of technology usually came late in the transition and never at the start. This brings us to the central point of the chapter. When used right, technology becomes an accelerator of momentum, not a creator of it. The good to great companies never began their transitions with pioneering technology, for the simple reason that you cannot make good use of technology until you know which technologies are relevant. And which are those? Those, and only those, that link directly to the 3 intersecting circles of the hedgehog concept. To make technology productive in a transformation from good to great means asking the following questions. Does the technology fit directly with your hedgehog concept? If yes, then you need to become a pioneer in the application of that technology. If no, then ask, do you need this technology at all? If yes, then all you need is parity. You don't necessarily need the world's most advanced phone system to be a great company. If no, then the technology is irrelevant, and you can ignore it. We came to see the pioneering application of technology as just one more way in which the good to great companies remained disciplined within the frame of their hedgehog concept. Conceptually, their relationship to technology is no different from their relationship to any other category of decisions, disciplined people, who engage in disciplined thought, and who then take disciplined action. If a technology doesn't fit squarely within their 3 circles, they ignore all the hype and fear and just go about their business with a remarkable degree of equanimity. However, once they understand which technologies are relevant, they become fanatical and creative in the application of those technologies. In the comparison companies, by contrast, we found only 3 cases of pioneering in the application of technology. Those 3 cases, Chrysler, computer-aided design, Harris, electronics applied to printing, and Rubbermaid, advanced manufacturing, were all unsustained comparisons. Which demonstrates that technology alone cannot create sustained great results. Chrysler, for instance, made superb use of advanced computer-aided and other design technologies, but failed to link those technologies to a consistent hedgehog concept. As Chrysler strayed outside the 3 circles in the mid-1980s, from Gulfstream jets to Maserati sports cars, no advanced technology, by itself, could save the company from another massive downturn. Technology without a clear hedgehog concept, and without the discipline to stay within the 3 circles, cannot make a company great. The technology trap. 2 incidents stand out in my mind as I write this chapter. The first is Time magazine's selection, in 1999, of Albert Einstein as person of the 20th century. If you frame the person of the century selection around the question, how different would the world be today if that person had not existed? The choice of Einstein is surprising, compared to leaders like Churchill, Hitler, Stalin, and Gandhi, people who truly changed the course of human history, for better or worse. Physicists point out that the scientific community would have reached an understanding of relativity with or without Einstein, perhaps 5 years later, certainly 10, but not 50. 20. The Nazis never got the bomb, and the Allies would have won the Second World War without it, although it would have cost more Allied lives. Why did Time pick Einstein? In explaining their selection, Time editors wrote, it's hard to compare the influence of statesmen with that of scientists. Nevertheless, we can note that there are certain eras that were most defined by their politics, others by their culture, and others by their scientific advances. So, how will the 20th century be remembered? Yes, for democracy. And yes, for civil rights. But the 20th century will be most remembered for its earth-shaking advances in science and technology, which advanced the cause of freedom, in some ways more than any statesman did. In a century that will be remembered foremost for its science and technology, one person stands out as the paramount icon of our age. Albert Einstein. 21. In essence, the Time editors didn't pick the person of the century so much as they picked the theme of the century, technology and science, and attached the most famous person to it. Interestingly, just a few days before the Einstein announcement, Time announced its person of the year for 1999. Who did it pick? None other than the poster child of e-commerce, Jeff Bezos of Amazon.com, reflecting yet again our cultural obsession with technology-driven change. Let me be clear. I neither agree nor disagree with Time's choices. I simply find them interesting and illuminating, because they give us a window into our modern psyche. Clearly, a key item on our collective mind is technology and its implications. Which brings me to the second incident. Taking a short break from the rigors of writing this book, I traveled to Minnesota to teach sessions at the Masters Forum. The Masters Forum has held executive seminars for nearly 15 years. And I was curious to know which themes appeared repeatedly over those years. One of the consistent themes, said Jim Erickson and Patty Griffin Jensen, program directors, is technology, change, and the connection between the two. Why do you suppose that is? I asked. People don't know what they don't know, they said. And they're always afraid that some new technology is going to sneak up on them from behind and knock them on the head. They don't understand technology, and many fear it. All they know for sure is that technology is an important force of change, and that they'd better pay attention to it. Given our culture's obsession with technology, and given the pioneering application of technology in the good to great companies, you might expect that technology would absorb a significant portion of the discussion in our interviews with good to great executives. We were quite surprised to find that fully 80% of the good to great executives we interviewed didn't even mention technology as one of the top 5 factors in the transition. Furthermore, in the cases where they did mention technology, it had a median ranking of 4th, with only 2 executives of 84 interviewed ranking at number 1. If technology is so vitally important, why did the good to great executives talk so little about it? Certainly not because they ignored technology. They were technologically sophisticated and vastly superior to their comparisons. Furthermore, a number of the good to great companies received extensive media coverage and awards for their pioneering use of technology. Yet the executives hardly talked about technology. It's as if the media articles and the executives were discussing 2 totally different sets of companies. Nuka, for example, became widely known as one of the most aggressive pioneers in the application of mini-mill steel manufacturing, with dozens of articles and 2 books that celebrated its bold investments in continuous thin slab casting and electric arc furnaces. 22 Nuka became a cornerstone case at business schools as an example of unseating the old order through the advanced application of new technologies. But when we asked Ken Iverson, CEO of Nuka, during its transition, to name the top 5 factors in the shift from good to great, where on the list do you think he put technology? First? No. Second? No. Third? Nope. Fourth? Not even. Fifth? Sorry, but no. The primary factors, said Ken Iverson, were the consistency of the company and our ability to project its philosophies throughout the whole organization, enabled by our lack of layers and bureaucracy. 23. Stop and think about that for a moment. Here we have a consummate case study of appending the old order with new technology, and the CEO, who made it happen, doesn't even list technology in the top 5 factors in the shift from good to great. This same pattern continued throughout the Nuka interviews. Of the 7 key executives and board members that we interviewed, only 1 picked technology as the number 1 factor in the shift, and most focused on other factors. A few executives did talk about Nuka's big bets on technology somewhere in the interview, but they emphasized other factors even more: getting people with a farmer work ethic on the bus, getting the right people in key management positions, the simple structure and lack of bureaucracy, the relentless performance culture that increases profit per ton of finished steel. Technology was part of the Nuka equation, but a secondary part. 1 Nuka executive summed up, 20% of our success is the new technology that we embrace. But 80% of our success is in the culture of our company. 24. Indeed, you could have given the exact same technology at the exact same time to any number of companies with the exact same resources as Nuka, and even still, they would have failed to deliver Nuka's results. Like the Daytona 500, the primary variable in winning is not the car, but the driver and his team. Not that the car is unimportant, but it is secondary. Mediocrity results first and foremost from management failure, not technological failure. Bethlehem Steel's difficulties had less to do with the mini-mill technology, and more to do with its history of adversarial labor relations, which ultimately had its roots in unenlightened and ineffective management. Bethlehem had already begun its long slide before Nuka, and the other mini-mills had taken significant market share. 25 In fact, by the time Nuka made its technological breakthrough with continuous thin slab casting in 1986, Bethlehem had already lost more than 80% of its value relative to the market. This is not to say that technology played no role in Bethlehem's demise. Technology did play a role, and ultimately a significant one. But technology's role was as an accelerator of Bethlehem's demise, not the cause of it. Again, it's the same principle at work: technology as an accelerator, not a cause. Only in this comparison case it is operating in reverse. Indeed, when we examined the comparison companies, we did not find a single example of a comparison company's demise coming primarily from a technology torpedo that blew it out of the water. R.J. Reynolds lost its position as the number 1 tobacco company in the world not because of technology, but because RJR management thrashed about with undisciplined diversification, and later went on a let's make management rich at the expense of the company buyout binge. A&P fell from the second largest company in America to irrelevance not because it lagged behind Kroger in scanning technology, but because it lacked the discipline to confront the brutal facts of reality about the changing nature of grocery stores. The evidence from our study does not support the idea that technological change plays the principal role in the decline of once great companies, or the perpetual mediocrity of others. Certainly, technology is important. You can't remain a laggard and hope to be great. But technology, by itself, is never a primary cause of either greatness or decline. Throughout business history, early technology pioneers rarely prevail in the end. Visa CALC, for example, was the first major personal computer spreadsheet. 26. Where is Visa CALC today? Do you know anyone who uses it? And what of the company that pioneered it? Gone, it doesn't even exist. Visa CALC eventually lost out to Lotus 123, which itself lost out to Excel. 27 Lotus then went into a tailspin, saved only by selling out to IBM. 28 Similarly, the first portable computers came from now dead companies, such as Osborne Computers. 29 Today, we primarily use portables from companies such as Dell and Sony. This pattern of the second, or third or fourth, follower prevailing over the early trailblazers, shows up through the entire history of technological and economic change. IBM did not have the early lead in computers. It lagged so far behind Remington Rand, which had the UNIVAC, the first commercially successful large-scale computer, that people called its first computer, IBM's UNIVAC. 30 Boeing did not pioneer the commercial jet. De Havilland did with the Comet, but lost ground when one of its early jets exploded in midair, not exactly a brand-building moment. Boeing, slower to market, invested in making the safest, most reliable jets and dominated the airways for over 3 decades. 31 I could go on for pages. GE did not pioneer the AC electrical system, Westinghouse did. 32 Palm Computing did not pioneer the personal digital assistant, Apple did, with its high-profile Newton. 33 AOL did not pioneer the consumer internet community, CompuServe and Prodigy did. 34. We could make a long list of companies that were technology leaders, but that failed to prevail in the end as great companies. It would be a fascinating list in itself, but all the examples would underscore a basic truth: technology cannot turn a good enterprise into a great one, nor by itself prevent disaster. History teaches this lesson repeatedly. Consider the United States debacle in Vietnam. The United States had the most technologically advanced fighting force the world has ever known. Super jet fighters, helicopter gunships, advanced weapons, computers, sophisticated communications, miles of high-tech border sensors. Indeed, the reliance on technology created a false sense of invulnerability. The Americans lacked not technology, but a simple and coherent concept for the war on which to attach that technology. It lurched back and forth across a variety of ineffective strategies, never getting the upper hand. Meanwhile, the technologically inferior North Vietnamese forces adhered to a simple, coherent concept, a guerrilla war of attrition, aimed at methodically wearing down public support for the war at home. What little technology the North Vietnamese did employ, such as the AK-47 rifle, much more reliable and easier to maintain in the field than the complicated M16, linked directly to that simple concept. And in the end, as you know, the United States, despite all its technological sophistication, did not succeed in Vietnam. If you ever find yourself thinking that technology alone holds the key to success, then think again of Vietnam. Indeed, thoughtless reliance on technology is a liability, not an asset. Yes, when used right, when linked to a simple, clear, and coherent concept rooted in deep understanding, technology is an essential driver in accelerating forward momentum. But when used wrong, when grasped as an easy solution, without deep understanding of how it links to a clear and coherent concept, technology simply accelerates your own self-created demise. Technology and the fear of being left behind. The research team ferociously debated whether this topic merited its own chapter. There must be a technology chapter, said Scott Jones. We're bombarded by the importance of technology these days at the business school. If we don't address it, we'll leave a huge hole in the book. But it seems to me, countered Brian Lesson, that our technology finding is just a special case of disciplined action, and it belongs in the previous chapter. Disciplined action means staying within the three circles, and that's the essence of our technology finding. True, but it is a very special case, pointed out Scott Cederberg. Every one of the companies became extreme pioneers in the application of technology long before the rest of the world became technology obsessed. But compared to other findings like Level 5, the hedgehog concept, and First 2, technology feels like a much smaller issue, retorted Amber Young. I agree with Brian, technology is important, but as a subset of discipline or perhaps the flywheel. We argued throughout the summer. Then Chris Jones, in her typically quiet and thoughtful way, asked a key question. Why did the good to great companies maintain such a balanced perspective on technology, when most companies become reactionary, lurching and running about like Chicken Little, as we're seeing with the internet? Why indeed? Chris's question led us to an essential difference between great companies and good companies, a difference that ultimately tipped the balance in favor of including this chapter. If you had the opportunity to sit down and read all 2,000 plus pages of transcripts from the good to great interviews, you'd be struck by the utter absence of talk about competitive strategy. Yes, they did talk about strategy, and they did talk about performance, and they did talk about becoming the best, and they even talked about winning. But they never talked in reactionary terms, and never defined their strategies principally in response to what others were doing. They talked in terms of what they were trying to create, and how they were trying to improve relative to an absolute standard of excellence. When we asked George Harvey to describe his motivation for bringing change to Pitney Bowes in the 1980s, he said, I've always wanted to see Pitney Bowes as a great company. Let's start with that, all right. Let's just start there. That's a given that needs no justification or explanation. We're not there today. We won't be there tomorrow. There is always so much more to create for greatness in an ever-changing world. 35, or as Wayne Sanders summed up about the ethos that came to typify the inner workings of Kimberly-Clark, we're just never satisfied. We can be delighted, but never satisfied. 36. Those who built the good to great companies weren't motivated by fear. They weren't driven by fear of what they didn't understand. They weren't driven by fear of looking like a chump. They weren't driven by fear of watching others hit it big while they didn't. They weren't driven by the fear of being hammered by the competition. No, those who turn good into great are motivated by a deep creative urge and an inner compulsion for sheer unadulterated excellence for its own sake. Those who build and perpetuate mediocrity, in contrast, are motivated more by the fear of being left behind. Never was there a better example of this difference than during the technology bubble of the late 1990s, which happened to take place right smack in the middle of the research on good to great. It served as an almost perfect stage to watch the difference between great and good play itself out, as the great ones responded like Walgreens, with calm equanimity and quiet deliberate steps forward, while the mediocre ones lurched about in fearful, frantic reaction. Indeed, the big point of this chapter is not about technology per se. No technology, no matter how amazing, not computers, not telecommunications, not robotics, not the internet, can by itself ignite a shift from good to great. No. Technology can make you level 5. No technology can turn the wrong people into the right people. No technology can instill the discipline to confront brutal facts of reality, nor can it instill unwavering faith. No technology can supplant the need for deep understanding of the three circles, and the translation of that understanding into a simple hedgehog concept. No technology can create a culture of discipline. No technology can instill the simple inner belief that leaving unrealized potential on the table, letting something remain good when it can become great, is a secular sin. Those that stay true to these fundamentals and maintain their balance, even in times of great change and disruption, will accumulate the momentum that creates breakthrough momentum. Those that do not, those that fall into reactionary lurching about, will spiral downward or remain mediocre. This is the big picture difference between great and good, the gestalt of the whole study captured in the metaphor of the flywheel versus the doom loop. And it is to that overarching contrast that we now turn. Chapter summary: Technology accelerators. Key points. Good to great organizations think differently about technology and technological change than mediocre ones. Good to great organizations avoid technology fads and bandwagons, yet they become pioneers in the application of carefully selected technologies. The key question about any technology is, does the technology fit directly with your hedgehog concept? If yes, then you need to become a pioneer in the application of that technology. If no, then you can settle for parity, or ignore it entirely. The good to great companies use technology as an accelerator of momentum, not a creator of it. None of the good to great companies began their transformations with pioneering technology, yet they all became pioneers in the application of technology once they grasped how it fit with their three circles, and after they hit breakthrough. You could have taken the exact same leading-edge technologies pioneered at the good to great companies and handed them to their direct comparisons for free, and the comparisons still would have failed to produce anywhere near the same results. How a company reacts to technological change is a good indicator of its inner drive for greatness versus mediocrity. Great companies respond with thoughtfulness and creativity, driven by a compulsion to turn unrealized potential into results. Mediocre companies react and lurch about, motivated by fear of being left behind. Unexpected findings. The idea that technological change is the principal cause in the decline of once great companies, or the perpetual mediocrity of others, is not supported by the evidence. Certainly, a company can't remain a laggard and hope to be great, but technology, by itself, is never primary root cause of either greatness or decline. Across 84 interviews with good to great executives, fully 80% didn't even mention technology as one of the top 5 factors in the transformation. This is true even in companies famous for their pioneering application of technology, such as Nuka. Crawl, walk, run can be a very effective approach, even during times of rapid and radical technological change. Chapter 8: The Flywheel and the Doom Loop. Revolution means turning the wheel. Igor Stravinsky 1. Picture a huge, heavy flywheel, a massive metal disc mounted horizontally on an axle, about 30 feet in diameter, 2 feet thick, and weighing about 5,000 pounds. Now imagine that your task is to get the flywheel rotating on the axle as fast and long as possible. Pushing with great effort, you get the flywheel to inch forward, moving almost imperceptibly at first. You keep pushing and after 2 or 3 hours of persistent effort, you get the flywheel to complete one entire turn. You keep pushing, and the flywheel begins to move a bit faster, and with continued great effort, you move it around a second rotation. You keep pushing in a consistent direction. 3 turns, 4, 5, 6, the flywheel builds up speed, 7, 8, you keep pushing, 9, 10, it builds momentum, 11, 12, moving faster with each turn, 20, 30, 50, 100. Then, at some point, breakthrough. The momentum of the thing kicks in your favor, hurling the flywheel forward, turn after turn, whoosh. Its own heavy weight working for you. You're pushing no harder than during the first rotation, but the flywheel goes faster and faster. Each turn of the flywheel builds upon work done earlier, compounding your investment of effort. 1,000 times faster, then 10,000, then 100,000. The huge heavy disc flies forward, with almost unstoppable momentum. Now suppose someone came along and asked, what was the one big push that caused this thing to go so fast? You wouldn't be able to answer. It's just a nonsensical question. Was it the first push? The second? The fifth? The 100th? No. It was all of them added together in an overall accumulation of effort applied in a consistent direction. Some pushes may have been bigger than others, but any single heave, no matter how large, reflects a small fraction of the entire cumulative effect upon the flywheel. Build up and breakthrough asterisk. The flywheel image captures the overall feel of what it was like inside the companies, as they went from good to great. No matter how dramatic the end result, the good to great transformations never happened in one fell swoop. There was no single defining action, no grand program, no one killer innovation, no solitary lucky break, no wrenching revolution. Good to great comes about by a cumulative process, step by step, action by action, decision by decision, turn by turn of the flywheel, that adds up to sustained and spectacular results. Yet to read media accounts of the companies, you might draw an entirely different conclusion. Often, the media does not cover a company until the flywheel is already turning at 1,000 rotations per minute. This entirely skews our perception of how such transformations happen, making it seem as if they jumped right to breakthrough, as some sort of an overnight metamorphosis. For example, on August 27, 1984, Forbes magazine published an article on Circuit City. It was the first national-level profile ever published on the company. It wasn't that big of an article, just 2 pages, and it questioned whether Circuit City's recent growth could continue. 2 still, there it was, the first public acknowledgement that Circuit City had broken through. The journalist had just identified a hot new company, almost like an overnight success story. This particular overnight success story, however, had been more than a decade in the making. Alan Wurtzel had inherited CEO responsibility from his father in 1973, with the firm close to bankruptcy. First, he rebuilt his executive team and undertook an objective look at the brutal facts of reality, both internal and external. In 1974, still struggling with a crushing debt load, Wurtzel and his team began to experiment with a warehouse showroom style of retailing, large inventories of name brands, discount pricing, and immediate delivery, and built a prototype of this model in Richmond, Virginia, to sell appliances. In 1976, the company began to experiment with selling consumer electronics in the warehouse showroom format, and in 1977, it transformed the concept into the first ever Circuit City store. The concept met with success, and the company began systematically converting its stereo stores into Circuit City stores. In 1982, with 9 years of accumulated turns on the flywheel, Wurtzel and his team committed fully to the concept of the Circuit City Superstore. Over the next 5 years, as it shifted entirely to this concept, Circuit City generated the highest total return to shareholders of any company on the New York Stock Exchange. 3 from 1982 to 1999, Circuit City generated cumulative stock returns 22 times better than the market, handily beating Intel, Walmart, GE, Hewlett-Packard, and Coca-Cola. Not surprisingly, Circuit City then found itself a prime subject for media attention. Whereas we found no articles of any significance in the decade leading up the transition, we found 97 articles worth examining in the decade after the transition, 22 of them significant pieces. It's as if the company hadn't even existed prior to that, despite having traded on a major stock exchange since 1968, and despite the remarkable progress made by Wurtzel and his team in the decade leading up to the breakthrough point. The Circuit City experience reflects a common pattern. In case after case, we found fewer articles in the decade leading up to the point of transition than in the decade after, by an average factor of nearly 3 times. 4. For example, Ken Iverson and Sam Siegel began turning the Nuka flywheel in 1965. For 10 years, no one paid any attention, certainly not the financial press, or the other steel companies. If you had asked executives at Bethlehem Steel or US Steel about the Nuka threat in 1970, they would have laughed, if they even recognized the company name at all, which is doubtful. By 1975, the year of its transition point on the stock chart, Nuka had already built its third mini-mill, long established its unique culture of productivity, and was well on its way to becoming the most profitable steel company in America. 5 Yet the first major article in Business Week did not appear until 1978, 13 years after the start of the transition, and not in Fortune until 16 years out. From 1965 through 1975, we found only 11 articles on Nuka, none of them significant. Then from 1976 through 1995, we collected 96 articles on Nuka, 40 of them being major profiles or nationally prominent features. Now, you might be thinking, but we should expect that. Of course these companies would get more coverage after they become wildly successful. What's so important about that? Here's what's important. We've allowed the way transitions look from the outside to drive our perception of what they must feel like to those going through them on the inside. From the outside, they look like dramatic, almost revolutionary breakthroughs. But from the inside, they feel completely different, more like an organic development process. Picture an egg just sitting there. No one pays it much attention until, one day, the egg cracks open and out jumps a chicken. All the major magazines and newspapers jump on the event, writing feature stories, the transformation of egg to chicken. The remarkable revolution of the egg. Stunning turnaround at egg. As if the egg had undergone some overnight metamorphosis, radically altering itself into a chicken. But what does it look like from the chicken's point of view? It's a completely different story. While the world ignored this dormant-looking egg, the chicken was evolving, growing, developing, incubating. From the chicken's point of view, cracking the egg is simply one more step in a long chain of steps leading up to that moment. A big step, to be sure, but hardly the radical, single-step transformation it looks like to those watching from outside the egg. It's a silly analogy, granted. But I'm using it to highlight a very important finding from our research. We kept thinking that we'd find the one big thing. The miracle moment that defined breakthrough. We even pushed for it in our interviews. But the good to great executives simply could not pinpoint a single key event or moment in time that exemplified the transition. Frequently, they chafed against the whole idea of allocating points and prioritizing factors. In every good to great company, at least one of the interviewees gave an unprompted admonishment, saying something along the lines of, look, you can't dissect this thing into a series of nice little boxes and factors, or identify the moment of aha, or the one big thing. It was a whole bunch of interlocking pieces that built one upon another. Even in the most dramatic case in our study, Kimberly-Clark selling the mills, the executives described an organic, cumulative process. Darwin did not change the direction of the company overnight, said one Kimberly-Clark executive. He evolved it over time. 6. The transition wasn't like night and day, said another. It was gradual, and I don't think it was entirely clear to everybody until a few years into it. 7. Of course, selling the mills was a gigantic push on the flywheel, but it was only one push. After selling the mills, the full transformation into the number one paper-based consumer products company required thousands of additional pushes on the flywheel, big and small, accumulated one on top of another. It took years to gain enough momentum for the press to openly herald Kimberly-Clark's shift from good to great. Forbes wrote, when Kimberly-Clark decided to go head-to-head against P&G, this magazine predicted disaster. What a dumb idea. As it turns out, it wasn't a dumb idea. It was a smart idea. 8. The amount of time between the two Forbes articles. 21 years. While working on the project, we made a habit of asking executives who visited our research laboratory what they would want to know from the research. One CEO asked, what did they call what they were doing? Did they have a name for it? How did they talk about it at the time? It's a great question, and we went back to look. The astounding answer, they didn't call it anything. The good to great companies had no name for their transformations. There was no launch event, no tagline, no programmatic feel whatsoever. Some executives said that they weren't even aware that a major transformation was underway until they were well into it. It was often more obvious to them after the fact than at the time. Then it began to dawn on us. There was no miracle moment. See the table on page 170. Although it may have looked like a single-stroke breakthrough to those peering in from the outside, it was anything but that to people experiencing the transformation from within. Rather, it was a quiet, deliberate process of figuring out what needed to be done to create the best future results and then simply taking those steps, one after the other, turn by turn of the flywheel. After pushing on that flywheel in a consistent direction over an extended period of time, they'd inevitably hit a point of breakthrough. When teaching this point, I sometimes use an example from outside my research that perfectly illustrates the idea, the UCLA Bruins basketball dynasty of the 1960s and early 1970s. Most basketball fans know that the Bruins won 10 NCAA championships in 12 years, at one point assembling a 6-1 game winning streak, under the legendary coach John Wooden. 21. But do you know how many years Wooden coached the Bruins before his first NCAA championship? 15. From 1948 to 1963, Wooden worked in relative obscurity before winning his first championship in 1964. Year by year, Coach Wooden built the underlying foundations, developing a recruiting system, implementing a consistent philosophy, and refining the full court press style of play. No one paid too much attention to the quiet, soft-spoken coach and his team until, wham, they hit breakthrough and systematically crushed every serious competitor for more than a decade. Like the Wooden dynasty, lasting transformations from good to great follow a general pattern of build-up followed by breakthrough. In some cases, the build-up to breakthrough stage takes a long time, in other cases, a shorter time. At Circuit City, the build-up stage lasted 9 years, at Nuka 10 years, whereas at Gillette it took only 5 years, at Fannie Mae only 3 years, and at Pitney Bowes about 2 years. But, no matter how short or long it took, every good to great transformation followed the same basic pattern, accumulating momentum, turn by turn of the flywheel, until build-up transformed into breakthrough. Not just a luxury of circumstance. It's important to understand that following the build-up breakthrough flywheel model is not just a luxury of circumstance. People who say, hey, but we've got constraints that prevent us from taking this longer-term approach, should keep in mind that the good to great companies followed this model no matter how dire the short-term circumstances, deregulation in the case of Wells Fargo, looming bankruptcy in the cases of Nuka and Circuit City, potential takeover threats in the cases of Gillette and Kroger, or million-dollar a-day losses in the case of Fannie Mae. This also applies to managing the short-term pressures of Wall Street. I just don't agree with those who say you can't build an enduring great company, because Wall Street won't let you, said David Maxwell of Fannie Mae. We communicated with analysts to educate them on what we were doing and where we were going. At first, a lot of people didn't buy into that, you just have to accept that. But once we got through the dark days, we responded by doing better every single year. After a few years, because of our actual results, we became a hot stock and never looked back. 22 and a hot stock it was. During Maxwell's first 2 years, the stock lagged behind the market, but then it took off. From the end of 1984 to the year 2000, $1 invested in Fannie Mae multiplied 6 to 4 times, beating the general market, including the wildly inflated Nasdaq of the late 1990s, by nearly 6 times. The good to great companies were subject to the same short-term pressures from Wall Street as the comparison companies. Yet, unlike the comparison companies, they had the patience and discipline to follow the build-up breakthrough flywheel model despite these pressures. And in the end, they attained extraordinary results by Wall Street's own measure of success. The key, we learned, is to harness the flywheel to manage these short-term pressures. One particularly elegant method for doing so came from Abbott Laboratories, using a mechanism it called the Blue Plans. Each year, Abbott would tell Wall Street analysts that it expected to grow earnings a specified amount, say 15%. At the same time, it would set an internal goal of a much higher growth rate, say 25%, or even 30%. Meanwhile, it kept a rank-ordered list of proposed entrepreneurial projects that had not yet been funded, the Blue Plans. Toward the end of the year, Abbott would pick a number that exceeded analyst expectations, but that fell short of its actual growth. It would then take the difference between the make the analysts happy growth and the actual growth and channel those funds into the Blue Plans. It was a brilliant mechanism for managing short-term pressures while systematically investing in the future. 23. We found no evidence of anything like the Blue Plans at Abbott's comparison company. Instead, Upjohn executives would pump up the stock with a sales job, buy into our future, reverently intoning the phrase investing for the long term, especially when the company failed to deliver current results. 24. Upjohn continually threw money after harebrained projects like its Regain Baldness Cure, attempting to circumvent build-up and jump right to breakthrough with a big hit. Indeed, Upjohn reminded us of a gambler, putting a lot of chips on red at Las Vegas and saying, see, we're investing for the future. Of course, when the future arrived, the promised results rarely appeared. Not surprisingly, Abbott became a consistent performer and a favorite holding on Wall Street, while Upjohn became a consistent disappointment. From 1959 to Abbott's point of breakthrough in 1974, the two stocks roughly tracked each other. Then they dramatically diverged, with Upjohn falling more than 6 times behind Abbott before being acquired in 1995. Like Fannie Mae and Abbott, all the good to great companies effectively managed Wall Street during their build-up breakthrough years, and they saw no contradiction between the two. They simply focused on accumulating results, often practicing the time-honored discipline of underpromising and over-delivering. And as the results began to accumulate, as the flywheel built momentum, the investing community came along with great enthusiasm. The flywheel effect. The good to great companies understood a simple truth: tremendous power exists in the fact of continued improvement and the delivery of results. Point to tangible accomplishments, however incremental at first, and show how these steps fit into the context of an overall concept that will work. When you do this in such a way that people see and feel the build-up of momentum, they will line up with enthusiasm. We came to call this the flywheel effect, and it applies not only to outside investors, but also to internal constituent groups. Let me share a story from the research. At a pivotal point in the study, members of the research team nearly revolted. Throwing their interview notes on the table, they asked, do we have to keep asking that stupid question? What stupid question? I asked. The one about commitment, alignment, and how they manage change. That's not a stupid question, I replied. It's one of the most important. Well, said one team member, a lot of the executives who made the transition, well, they think it's a stupid question. Some don't even understand the question. Yes, we need to keep asking it, I said. We need to be consistent across the interviews. And besides, it's even more interesting that they don't understand the question. So, keep probing. We've got to understand how they overcame resistance to change and got people lined up. I fully expected to find that getting everyone lined up, creating alignment, to use the jargon, would be one of the top challenges faced by executives working to turn good into great. After all, nearly every executive who'd visited the laboratory had asked this question in one form or another. How do we get the boat turned? How do we get people committed to the new vision? How do we motivate people to line up? How do we get people to embrace change? To my great surprise, we did not find the question of alignment to be a key challenge faced by the good to great leaders. Clearly, the good to great companies did get incredible commitment and alignment. They artfully managed change, but they never really spent much time thinking about it. It was utterly transparent to them. We learned that under the right conditions, the problems of commitment, alignment, motivation, and change just melt away. They largely take care of themselves. Consider Kroger. How do you get a company of over 50,000 people, cashiers, baggers, shelf stockers, produce washers, and so forth, to embrace a radical new strategy that will eventually change virtually every aspect of how the company builds and runs grocery stores? The answer is that you don't. Not in one big event or program, anyway. Jim Herring, the level 5 leader who initiated the transformation of Kroger, told us that he avoided any attempts at hoopla and motivation. Instead, he and his team began turning the flywheel, creating tangible evidence that their plans made sense. We presented what we were doing in such a way that people saw our accomplishments, said Herring. We tried to bring our plans to successful conclusion step by step, so that the mass of people would gain confidence from the successes, not just the words. 25 Herring understood that the way to get people lined up behind a bold new vision is to turn the flywheel consistent with that vision, from 2 turns to 4, then 4 to 8, then 8 to 16. And then to say, see what we're doing, and how well it is working. Extrapolate from that, and that's where we're going. The good to great companies tended not to publicly proclaim big goals at the outset. Rather, they began to spin the flywheel, understanding to action, step after step, turn after turn. After the flywheel built up momentum, they'd look up and say, hey, if we just keep pushing on this thing, there's no reason we can't accomplish X. For example, Nucor began turning the flywheel in 1965, at first just trying to avoid bankruptcy, then later building its first steel mills, because it could not find a reliable supplier. Nucor people discovered that they had a knack for making steel better and cheaper than anyone else, so they built 2, and then 3, additional mini mills. They gained customers, then more customers, then more customers, whoosh, the flywheel built momentum, turn by turn, month by month, year by year. Then, around 1975, it dawned on the Nucor people that if they just kept pushing on the flywheel, they could become the number 1 most profitable steel company in America. Explained Marvin Pullman. I remember talking with Ken Iverson in 1975, and he said, Marv, I think we can become the number 1 steel company in the US, 1975. And I said to him, now, Ken, when are you going to be number 1? I don't know, he said. But if we just keep doing what we're doing, there's no reason why we can't become number 1. 26 It took over 2 decades, but Nucor kept pushing the flywheel, eventually generating greater profits than any other steel company on the Fortune 1000 list. 27. When you let the flywheel do the talking, you don't need to fervently communicate your goals. People can just extrapolate from the momentum of the flywheel for themselves. Hey, if we just keep doing this, look at where we can go. As people decide among themselves to turn the fact of potential into the fact of results, the goal almost sets itself. Stop and think about it for a minute. What do the right people want more than almost anything else? They want to be part of a winning team. They want to contribute to producing visible, tangible results. They want to feel the excitement of being involved in something that just flat out works. When the right people see a simple plan born of confronting the brutal facts, a plan developed from understanding, not bravado, they are likely to say, that'll work. Count me in. When they see the monolithic unity of the executive team behind the simple plan and the selfless, dedicated qualities of level 5 leadership, they'll drop their cynicism. When people begin to feel the magic of momentum, when they begin to see tangible results, when they can feel the flywheel beginning to build speed, that's when the bulk of people line up to throw their shoulders against the wheel and push. The doom loop. We found a very different pattern at the comparison companies. Instead of a quiet, deliberate process of figuring out what needed to be done and then simply doing it, the comparison companies frequently launched new programs, often with great fanfare and hoopla aimed at motivating the troops, only to see the programs fail to produce sustained results. They sought the single defining action, the grand program, the one killer innovation, the miracle moment that would allow them to skip the arduous build-up stage and jump right to breakthrough. They would push the flywheel in one direction, then stop, change course, and throw it in a new direction, and then they would stop, change course, and throw it into yet another direction. After years of lurching back and forth, the comparison companies failed to build sustained momentum and fell instead into what we came to call the doom loop. Consider the case of Warner Lambert, the direct comparison company to Gillette. In 1979, Warner Lambert told Businessweek that it aimed to be a leading consumer products company. 28. 1 year later, in 1980, it did an abrupt about-face and turned its sights on healthcare, saying, "Our flat-out aim is to go after Merck, Lilly, SmithKline, everybody and his brother." 29. In 1981, the company reversed course yet again and returned to diversification and consumer goods. 30. 6 years later, in 1987, Warner Lambert did another U-turn, away from consumer goods, to try once again to be like Merck. At the same time, the company spent 3 times as much on consumer goods advertising as on R&D, a somewhat puzzling strategy for a company trying to beat Merck. 31. In the early 1990s, reacting to Clinton-era healthcare reform, the company threw itself into reverse yet again and re-embraced diversification and consumer brands. 32. Each new Warner Lambert CEO brought his own new program and halted the momentum of his predecessor. Ward Hagen tried to create a breakthrough with an expensive acquisition in the hospital supply business in 1982. 3 years later, his successor, Joe Williams, extracted Warner Lambert from the hospital supply business and took a $550 million write-off. 33. He tried to focus the company on beating Merck, but his successor threw the company back to diversification and consumer goods. And so it went, back and forth, lurch and thrash, with each CEO trying to make a mark with his own program. From 1979 through 1998, Warner Lambert underwent 3 major restructurings, one per CEO, hacking away 20,000 people in search of quick breakthrough results. Time and again, the company would attain a burst of results, then slacken, never attaining the sustained momentum of a build-up breakthrough flywheel. Stock returns flattened relative to the market, and Warner Lambert disappeared as an independent company, swallowed up by Pfizer. 34. The Warner Lambert case is extreme, but we found some version of the doom loop in every comparison company. See Appendix 8.A for a summary. While the specific permutations of the doom loop varied from company to company, there were some highly prevalent patterns, 2 of which deserve particular note: the misguided use of acquisitions and the selection of leaders who undid the work of previous generations. The misguided use of acquisitions. Peter Drucker once observed that the drive for mergers and acquisitions comes less from sound reasoning and more from the fact that doing deals is a much more exciting way to spend your day than doing actual work. 35. Indeed, the comparison companies would have well understood the popular bumper sticker from the 1980s, "When the going gets tough, we go shopping." To understand the role of acquisitions in the process of going from good to great, we undertook a systematic qualitative and quantitative analysis of all acquisitions and divestitures in all the companies in our study, from 10 years before the transition date through 1998. While we noticed no particular pattern in the amount or scale of acquisitions, we did note a significant difference in the success rate of the acquisitions in the good to great companies versus the comparisons. See Appendix 8.B. Why did the good to great companies have a substantially higher success rate with acquisitions, especially major acquisitions? The key to their success was that their big acquisitions generally took place after development of the hedgehog concept and after the flywheel had built significant momentum. They used acquisitions as an accelerator of flywheel momentum, not a creator of it. In contrast, the comparison companies frequently tried to jump right to breakthrough via an acquisition or merger. It never worked. Often with their core business under siege, the comparison companies would dive into a big acquisition as a way to increase growth, diversify away their troubles, or make a CEO look good. Yet they never addressed the fundamental question: what can we do better than any other company in the world that fits our economic denominator and that we have passion for? They never learned the simple truth that, while you can buy your way to growth, you absolutely cannot buy your way to greatness. 2 big mediocrities joined together never make one great company. Leaders who stop the flywheel. The other frequently observed doom loop pattern is that of new leaders who stepped in, stopped an already spinning flywheel, and threw it in an entirely new direction. Consider Harris Corporation, which applied many of the good to great concepts in the early 1960s and began a classic build-up process that led to breakthrough results. George Dively and his successor, Richard Tullis, identified a hedgehog concept based on the understanding that Harris could be the best in the world at applying technology to printing and communications. Although it did not adhere to this concept with perfect discipline, Tullis had a penchant for straying a bit outside the 3 circles. The company did make enough progress to produce significant results. It looked like a promising candidate for a good to great transformation, hitting breakthrough in 1975. Then the flywheel came to a grinding halt. In 1978, Joseph Boyd became chief executive. Boyd had previously been with Radiation Incorporated, a corporation acquired by Harris years earlier. His first key decision as CEO was to move the company headquarters from Cleveland to Melbourne, Florida, Radiation's hometown, and the location of Boyd's house and 47-foot powerboat, the Lazy Rascal. 36. In 1983, Boyd threw a giant wrench into the flywheel by divesting the printing business. At the time, Harris was the #1 producer of printing equipment in the world. The printing business was one of the most profitable parts of the company, generating nearly a third of total operating profits. 37. What did Boyd do with the proceeds from selling off this corporate gem? He threw the company headlong into the office automation business. But could Harris become the best in the world in office automation? Not likely. Horrendous software development problems delayed introduction of Harris' first workstation as the company stumbled onto the battlefield to confront IBM, December, and Wang. 38. Then, in an attempt to jump right to a new breakthrough, Harris spent a third of its entire corporate net worth to buy Lani Business Products, a company in the low-end word processing business. 39. Computer World magazine wrote, Boyd targeted the automated office as a key. Unfortunately, for Harris, the company had everything but an office product. The attempt to design and market a word processing system met with dismal failure, out of tune with the market, and had to be scrapped before introduction. 40. The flywheel, which had been spinning with great momentum after Dively and Tullis, came detached from the axle, wobbled into the air, and then crashed to a grinding halt. From the end of 1973 to the end of 1978, Harris beat the market by more than 5 times. But from the end of 1978 to the end of 1983, Harris fell 39% behind the market, and by 1988, it had fallen over 70% behind. The doom loop replaced the flywheel. The flywheel as a wraparound idea. When I look over the good to great transformations, the one word that keeps coming to mind is consistency. Another word offered to me by physics professor R. J. Peterson is coherence. What is 1 + 1, he asked, then paused for effect. 4. In physics, we have been talking about the idea of coherence, the magnifying effect of one factor upon another. In reading about the flywheel, I couldn't help but think of the principle of coherence. However you phrase it, the basic idea is the same. Each piece of the system reinforces the other parts of the system to form an integrated whole that is much more powerful than the sum of the parts. It is only through consistency over time, through multiple generations, that you get maximum results. In a sense, everything in this book is an exploration and description of the pieces of the build-up to breakthrough flywheel pattern. See the table on page 183. In standing back to survey the overall framework, we see that every factor works together to create this pattern, and each component produces a push on the flywheel. It all starts with level 5 leaders, who naturally gravitate toward the flywheel model. They are less interested in flashy programs that make it look like they are leading. With a capital L. They are more interested in the quiet, deliberate process of pushing on the flywheel to produce results. With a capital R. Getting the right people on the bus, the wrong people off the bus, and the right people in the right seats. These are all crucial steps in the early stages of build-up, very important pushes on the flywheel. Equally important is to remember the Stockdale paradox. We're not going to hit breakthrough by Christmas, but if we keep pushing in the right direction, we will eventually hit breakthrough. This process of confronting the brutal facts helps you see the obvious, albeit difficult, steps that must be taken to turn the flywheel. Faith in the endgame helps you live through the months or years of build-up. Next, when you attain deep understanding about the 3 circles of your hedgehog concept and begin to push in a direction consistent with that understanding, you hit breakthrough momentum and accelerate, with key accelerators, chief among them pioneering the application of technology tied directly back to your 3 circles. Ultimately, to reach breakthrough means having the discipline to make a series of good decisions consistent with your hedgehog concept, disciplined action, following from disciplined people who exercise disciplined thought. That's it. That's the essence of the breakthrough process. In short, if you diligently and successfully apply each concept in the framework, and you continue to push in a consistent direction on the flywheel, accumulating momentum step by step and turn by turn, you will eventually reach breakthrough. It might not happen today, or tomorrow, or next week. It might not even happen next year. But it will happen. And when it does, you will face an entirely new set of challenges: how to accelerate momentum in response to ever-rising expectations, and how to ensure that the flywheel continues to turn long into the future. In short, your challenge will no longer be how to go from good to great, but how to go from great to enduring great. And that is the subject of the last chapter. Asterisk credit for the terms build-up and breakthrough should go to David S. Lambs and his book, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, Why Some Are So Rich and Some So Poor, New York, W. W. Norton and Company, 1998. On page 200, Lambs writes, the question is really twofold. First, why and how did any country break through the crust of habit and conventional knowledge to this new mode of production? Turning to the first, I would stress build-up, the accumulation of knowledge and know-how, and breakthrough, reaching and passing thresholds. When we read this paragraph, we noted its applicability to our study and decided to adopt these terms in describing the good to great companies. Chapter summary: the flywheel and the doom loop. Key points. Good to great transformations often look like dramatic, revolutionary events to those observing from the outside, but they feel like organic, cumulative processes to people on the inside. The confusion of end outcomes, dramatic results, with process, organic and cumulative, skews our perception of what really works over the long haul. No matter how dramatic the end result, the good to great transformations never happened in one fell swoop. There was no single defining action, no grand program, no one killer innovation, no solitary lucky break, no miracle moment. Sustainable transformations follow a predictable pattern of build-up and breakthrough. Like pushing on a giant, heavy flywheel, it takes a lot of effort to get the thing moving at all, but with persistent pushing in a consistent direction over a long period of time, the flywheel builds momentum, eventually hitting a point of breakthrough. The comparison companies followed a different pattern, the doom loop. Rather than accumulating momentum, turn by turn of the flywheel, they tried to skip build-up and jump immediately to breakthrough. Then, with disappointing results, they'd lurch back and forth, failing to maintain a consistent direction. The comparison companies frequently tried to create a breakthrough with large, misguided acquisitions. The good to great companies, in contrast, principally used large acquisitions after breakthrough to accelerate momentum in an already fast-spinning flywheel. Unexpected results. Those inside the good to great companies were often unaware of the magnitude of their transformation at the time. Only later, in retrospect, did it become clear. They had no name, tagline, launch event, or program to signify what they were doing at the time. The good to great leaders spent essentially no energy trying to create alignment, motivate the troops, or manage change. Under the right conditions, the problems of commitment, alignment, motivation, and change largely take care of themselves. Alignment principally follows from results and momentum, not the other way around. The short-term pressures of Wall Street were not inconsistent with following this model. The flywheel effect is not in conflict with these pressures. Indeed, it is the key to managing them. Chapter 9: From Good to Great to Built to Last. It is your work in life that is the ultimate seduction. Pablo Picasso 1. When we began the Good to Great research project, we confronted a dilemma. How should we think about the ideas in Built to Last while doing the Good to Great research? Briefly, Built to Last, based on a 6-year research project conducted at Stanford Business School in the early 1990s, answered the question, what does it take to start and build an enduring great company from the ground up? My research mentor and co-author Jerry I. Porras and I studied 18 enduring great companies, institutions that stood the test of time, tracing their founding in some cases back to the 1800s, while becoming the iconic great companies of the late 20th century. We examined companies like Procter & Gamble, founded in 1837, American Express, founded in 1850, Johnson & Johnson, founded in 1886, and GE, founded in 1892. One of the companies, Citicorp, now Citigroup, was founded in 1812, the same year Napoleon marched into Moscow. The youngest companies in the study were Walmart and Sony, which trace their origins back to 1945. Similar to this book, we used direct comparison companies, 3M versus Norton, Walt Disney versus Columbia Pictures, Marriott versus Howard Johnson, and so forth, for 18 paired comparisons. In short, we sought to identify the essential distinctions between great companies and good companies as they endure over decades, even centuries. When I had the first summer research team assembled for the Good to Great project, I asked, what should be the role of Built to Last in doing this study? I don't think it should play any role, said Brian Bagley. I didn't join this team to do a derivative piece of work. Neither did I, added Alison Sinclair. I'm excited about a new project and a new question. It wouldn't be very fulfilling to just fill in the pieces of your other book. But wait a minute, I responded. We spent 6 years on the previous study. It might be helpful to build on our previous work. I seem to recall that you got the idea for this study when a McKinsey partner said that Built to Last didn't answer the question of how to change a good company into a great one, noted Paul Weissman. What if the answers are different? Back and forth, to and fro, the debate continued for a few weeks. Then Stephanie Judd weighed in with the argument that swayed me. I love the ideas in Built to Last and that's what worries me, she said. I'm afraid that if we start with BTL as the frame of reference, we'll just go around in circles, proving our own biases. It became clear that there would be substantially less risk in starting from scratch, setting out to discover what we would, whether it matched previous work or not. Early in the research, then, we made a very important decision. We decided to conduct the research for Good to Great as if Built to Last didn't exist. This was the only way to clearly see the key factors in transforming a good company into a great one with minimal bias from previous work. Then we could return to ask, how, if at all, do the two studies relate? Now, 5 years later, with this book complete, we can stand back to look at the two works in the context of each other. Surveying across the two studies, I offer the following 4 conclusions. 1. When I consider the enduring great companies from built to last, I now see substantial evidence that the early leaders followed the good to great framework. The only real difference is that they did so as entrepreneurs in small, early-stage enterprises trying to get off the ground, rather than as CEOs trying to transform established companies from good to great. 2. In an ironic twist, I now see good to great not as a sequel to built to last, but as a prequel. Apply the findings in this book to create sustained great results, as a startup, or an established organization, and then apply the findings in built to last to go from great results to an enduring great company. 3. To make the shift from a company with sustained great results to an enduring great company of iconic stature, apply the central concept from built to last, discover your core values and purpose beyond just making money, core ideology, and combine this with the dynamic of preserve the core to stimulate progress. 4. A tremendous resonance exists between the two studies. The ideas from each enrich and inform the ideas in the other. In particular, good to great answers a fundamental question raised, but not answered, in built to last. What is the difference between a good BHAG, big hairy audacious goal, and a bad BHAG? Good to great in the early stages of built to last. Looking back on the built to last study, it appears that the enduring great companies did in fact go through a process of build-up to breakthrough, following the good to great framework during their formative years. Consider, for example, the build-up breakthrough flywheel pattern in the evolution of Walmart. Most people think that Sam Walton just exploded onto the scene with his visionary idea for rural discount retailing, hitting breakthrough almost as a startup company. But nothing could be further from the truth.